Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, and we are here today with always the amazing Gnostic informant, Gennady Stolyarov II, who is the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party, and the wonderful and brilliant Grayson Quay, who recently wrote a new book, The Transhumanist Temptation. And that's what we're going to be talking about today when it comes to how far can people get to the level of being completely disconnected from any kind of telos of the good and becoming, I guess I should say, like the people who were recently in the news talking about transhumanism in a way, where we had this hot mic moment from the Beijing parade with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. So Xi said that people rarely lived past 70 before. Now at 70, you're still a child, Putin. And Putin said with biotech, organs can be replaced endlessly. People could even reach immortality. Some predict, Xi said, people might live up to 150 years this century. So that, I think, should be a good way to start it off. And I would love to get to Gennady. Do you want to push back on these people, or are you in agreement with their plans here? You know, what could go wrong? Why not have Xi and Putin live to that length? I think that would be a good way to start. And then we're going to get to Grayson and Gnostic Informant. You're going to be the man in the middle for tonight. You are going to be balancing out these two forces. So, Gennady, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Lev, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. As always, I think this should be a fascinating conversation and debate. So I view the comments by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin as actually a highly promising development with the potential to greatly de-escalate global tension and bring about a more peaceful, more prosperous, longer-lived world for all of us. And I will say to our viewers, Lev, I think you know this because we have discussed this over the past 3 years, and anybody who has heard me speak over the past 3 years knows that I am not a fan of Putin's or Xi's aggressive foreign policy. I do not like the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine. He did not have to do that. I do not like the fact that Xi Jinping has designs on Taiwan. But I wonder sometimes what pushes them in that direction. I think it is this sense of urgency in trying to secure their legacy. They sense that their ages are advancing. They're both 72 years old. They're not as young as they used to be, certainly, and they feel like they need to leave behind some great accomplishment, and they think in these zero-sum power terms, these nationalistic terms. So getting a big chunk of territory that their countries have laid a historic claim to would be their legacy. But what if they didn't have to think that way? What if instead their legacy could be a much longer project pursued in a more leisurely way, in a way that builds ties rather than breaking them, in a way that extends lives and improves lives rather than cutting them short, as especially Putin has tragically been responsible for. So what I hope from these remarks is that maybe their interest in radical life extension could get them to redirect the investment of their regime's resources away from destruction and toward biotechnology, toward medical science, toward extending the lifespans, not just of themselves, but of as many people as possible, and toward international cooperation, because this cannot be done in a vacuum. There is a vibrant international scientific community. Of course, a lot of scientists who are interested in radical life extension reside in the United States, but many reside in the Union, and also Russia.
I don't know what's going on. Gennady, your connection is getting a little bit bad right now. Just so you know, I don't know if there's something going on there. Yeah, the connection is not that good towards the end. Yes, you'll figure that out, but I definitely want to get a response from Grayson about that.
See if he's plugged in. See if he's plugged in or he's on Wi-Fi. If he's on Wi-Fi, that might be the issue.
Yeah, because you're
plug in, then do it if you have the option.
Yes, plug in if you can. While you're figuring that out, though, Grayson, so would these dictators, would these complete carnage creating criminals perhaps have a change of heart and be less aggressive if they did have more time?
Well, this strikes me as the sort of armchair psychologizing that you tend to get from other outlets that I've seen. There was that famous poem that if I had been Putin's mother, I would have snuggled him longer and he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. There's the constant bromide of, oh, if women were in charge of countries, there wouldn't be wars, when in fact studies seem to suggest that women start more wars. This seems like armchair psychologizing in the same vein. I could easily make a parallel case looking at young rulers from history, Henry V or Edward III, for example, who, are young and full of piss and vinegar and go off and start wars because they feel invincible, and because they haven't seen the carnage of war yet. And then compare that to some, older leader that I pick who, as he matured in office and as he saw the cost of war and became more conscious of his own mortality, started to develop a greater degree of empathy for the soldiers under his command and for the people who might suffer in the wars he started. So I can't say I'm particularly convinced by this hypothetical here. Beyond that, I'll just say it's, a little frightening that you would want two of the potentially most destabilizing figures in the world today. That's an argument one could make, to live forever, potentially. The best thing about tyrants is that they all have to die and meet their maker sometime. In your world, a good enough tyrant could simply stay in power for 10,000 years and turn the world into a living hell in his own image. And I don't see any reason to think that just because someone is immortal, they will automatically become moral. I could have done a fun pun there. Just because you're immortal doesn't mean you'll stop being immoral, right? Xi Jinping, I'm not surprised by with this. He's an atheist communist, right? But I'm a little disappointed in Putin. As a good Orthodox Christian, he should.
What good Orthodox Christian? Are you high?
Be prepared to meet his maker someday.
Grayson, are you out of your mind? Putin, a good Orthodox Christian? This is the guy who caused his own people to starve because he was buying cocaine money from St. Petersburg Harbor from Latin America in order to sell to his oligarch friends. This guy is as far as you can possibly get from a quote-unquote good Orthodox Christian.
It's a joke, Lev. I don't want to get on your bad side here. I'm just saying.
It's okay. We're safe from going into the Ukraine for this subject. We're not going into Ukraine, so no worries there. But Neil, do you concur with Grayson about Putin and Xi Jinping not really being good examples of people who would change their minds when it comes to living forever? But even more so, would you say for all the leaders that you've seen in history, the Julius Caesars that you've studied, all of these great people, do you see there being any kind of point, even to Alexander the Great, let's say, to live for a longer amount of time than they did? Like, how long is too long for somebody who has that much power? Because wouldn't they, like, I kind of agree with Grayson here, wouldn't they deteriorate in terms of their, morals over time?
No, I actually agree with Grayson. I do think that at some point, people get corrupt with too much power. I do think history does show us that indeed. So I do think the idea of ever changing areas of power is good, if that makes sense. I have nothing to
I would like
with on that. Go ahead. Good.
I would like to finish my argument because I don't know where I got cut off.
Yeah.
I may have to reconnect via another device if this attempt fails.
The last thing I caught was that, the scientists working on radical life extension were mostly in the United States, and then I lost you.
So the idea is it would be in their self-interest to connect with this community of scientists, and some are in the US, some are in Europe, some are in East Asian countries that are freer, like Singapore, for example. And I think they would want to figure out a way to actually sustainably extend their lives, which means they can't just rely on their own subordinates or the people in their jurisdiction. They have to participate in a worldwide endeavor. And what that means is, irrespective of who they are as people, irrespective of what, let's say, cruel tactics or cold-heartedly destructive tactics they may potentially be willing to employ, they're going to have to behave themselves a bit better. They're going to have to build ties with the international community if they want this prize of greatly extended longevity. And I will also point out, most dictators throughout history have not died of so-called natural causes. They usually met a violent end, and that's because they upset too many people, or they upset the wrong people who revolted against them. So being a dictator is not exactly the safest occupation, as my friend Dr. Aubrey de Grey likes to point out. And so just because they would be able to biologically extend their lives doesn't mean they would be less vulnerable if they cross certain lines in oppressing their people. And also, they're not going to be the only ones who would get radical life extension. Everybody else would have at least the possibility of accessing these technologies, because we've seen throughout history, once scientific knowledge is attained, it can't just be hoarded. Even if some governments may try to keep it secret, they'll only succeed for a time. And then that knowledge will become more diffuse. So if other people will have access to greater length and greater quality of life, they will feel like they have more to lose from being politically oppressed. We know that the countries where there are liberalizing tendencies are not countries where people are dirt poor and their lives are nasty, brutish, and short. They're countries where there's a thriving middle class, where people see hope for upward mobility, and they might see some oppressive structures or overly rigid structures standing in their way. That's how revolutions happen, by the way. So I think these longer-lived dictators are going to have to change their act. And maybe some of them might become tired of playing these power games eventually. That may be further off, but maybe Putin or Xi will think, well, I've stayed in power for 30, 40, 50 years. And maybe if I can effectuate a peaceful transition away from my rule, then my own people won't kill me if I depart, which is what they're afraid of, which is why they're hanging on to power. And instead, I'll be able to retire to one of my many villas and live the life of a private citizen. At least I hope that they will find some off-ramp like that. Of course, this is very hypothetical. But what I'm saying is, I'm glad that they're at least talking about that, because extending life is the exact opposite of destroying life. And I want to make that distinction. Transhumanism is about extending life. So we don't support the dictators when they try to destroy life. We want to channel them in better directions so that they engage with the international community of freedom-loving transhumanists to a greater extent.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, I'm interested by your proposition that you seem to be implying that kind of all wars and social dysfunctions and so on are the result of this of some kind of underlying fear of death that people share. It's this kind of Hobbesianism taken to the logical conclusion, where you're going to, instead of founding society on some concept of virtue or of the good, you're going to found it kind of on the lowest common denominator of the shared fear of death, that life is, nasty, brutish, and short, and that, the way to escape that is to found a state that, lets people have the degree of freedom that they can have, and is silent about the higher ends of man, just sort of leaves everyone alone to pursue his own life plan and to try to self-actualize in whatever way seems best to him. This, I think, is, exactly kind of the transhumanist political program that I map out in my book. And I think it's leading us to some dark places and doesn't really have a limiting factor. So I wanted to back up a little bit. You talk about radical life extension a lot, and I want to draw a line that you probably won't consider valid, but that is very important to me. So in one sense, we've already had radical life extension. If you go back to 1800, the average life expectancy in most of the world is around 40. There's not much of a difference at that point between Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. Everyone's basically dying in their 40s. It's only in the 1800s that it really starts to diverge. Europe pulls ahead, and then the rest of the world slowly catches up. That's, you could still probably live to 80 if you lived out of your teens or 20s. But there were a lot of deaths at 0 or 1, dragging the average down.
Yeah,
But still, that's radical life extension, right? And
I
we've
think
gone.
the numbers are skewed though because so many childbirths.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But
And I would say,
we
by
already
the
had
way-
radical life extension in the sense of the average, and that comes largely as the result of better nutrition, better medicine, the invention of vaccines, all these good things. Can I say that on the stream? Can I say vaccines?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that time's over. It's fine now. Styx doesn't seem to think
agree with
so,
you.
but it's fine.
So this
I
comes
agree with you,
about
by
as
the way.
all of these things. And the reason I wanted to get this out there is because when you write a book about how transhumanism is bad, or when you critique technology in any way whatsoever, no matter how careful and reasoned you are with your argument, you always get these comments of just, oh, you're a Luddite, you don't like technology. You know, if you'd been around in the caveman times, you'd have said, we can't sharpen sticks, we have to keep throwing rocks. And that's not how I feel. In fact, I would love to be a techno-optimist. I'm very pleased by some of the developments of technology. I'm very excited by where it'll go in the future. And I'm not necessarily opposed to extending life through applications of medicine as medicine was traditionally understood. Whether that's by figuring out a cure for cancer or heart disease, whether that's by building better prosthetics and replacement and artificial organs. These are all things that I don't actually view as transhumanism or as transhumanist applications of technology. The reason for that is something I go into in the book, but basically it's starts with a teleological or a natural law framework. So for most of medical history, the starting point was that we know what a flourishing human being looks like. We know what a healthy human being looks like. You have to, otherwise you wouldn't know how to fix what's wrong. If my arm is broken, you have to know what a healthy arm looks like before you can set it properly. If my kidney is cancerous, you have to know what a non-cancerous kidney looks like to restore my kidney to the flourishing proper to it as a kidney, and ultimately to restore me to the flourishing proper to me as a human being. Where I think we've departed and veered into transhumanism, at least in the medical sciences, is when we say we're going to throw out that idea of human flourishing and of restoring that natural human flourishing, and instead act in accordance with the patient's desires or the patient's will. The sort of, example of this that Mary Harrington talks about in Feminism Against Progress, which is a great book, is the birth control pill, where a woman's having a healthy monthly cycle and medical science steps in and disrupts that, not in accordance with her will, not to make her healthier, but to cater to her desires. Abortion works on the same principle. You're having a healthy pregnancy, and medical science steps in and interrupts that gestation of that unborn child that's happening healthily and normally and naturally. Puberty blockers would be another example. A child is going through healthy puberty naturally, which is, the healthy state and the flourishing proper to them as a boy or a girl, and we step in and give them drugs to interrupt that. Now, those same drugs can be used for good if you start puberty early, right? We know when puberty should start in a healthy human being, and if it starts too early and we need to slow it down, that would be a use of that technology in accord with a teleological conception of medicine. So all that to say, with regard to life extension, I don't have a problem with extending life if we get better at fixing our bodies as they break. Moses lives to 120, his eye undimmed, his vigor unabated. I think we could all aspire to such a thing. Where I get nervous is when it comes to making changes to the human body that are extrinsic to human nature, splicing in genes from mole rats to produce high-weight hyaluronic acid, for example. Or whatever the hell Brian Johnson is doing. These are all things that, frighten me, because it is that transhumanist intervention through medical science that is extrinsic to human flourishing, that is not connected to any teleological view of the human person, and that basically tears down the guardrails and creates this free-for-all where now anything can be done to us and we can do anything to ourselves so long as we consent to it. And that's where I think we've crossed the line.
Before Gennady responds, I just want to make sure so that everybody understands. Grayson, you see humans as human being as opposed to human becoming, if you had to choose one of those two.
Yeah, so I'm an Aristotelian. I'm not a Nietzschean or a Sartrean, right? I don't believe that existence precedes essence. I believe there is such a thing as human nature. I know there are secular natural law theorists. For me, that idea is grounded partly in my faith. I think it's something that can be known through reason. I think ultimately my faith is what provides the anchor for it. But Aristotle wasn't a Christian, or even it appears a particularly religious man as regards the Greek gods. But he believed in this as well. There's Jewish and Islamic natural law traditions. There's a Catholic one through Thomas Aquinas. This is a pretty widely shared idea.
And I want to make sure that we'll have a chance to go through that with Gnostic Informant as well. So just stay tuned, everybody, for that too. But Gennady, please let me know what your thoughts are.
Yes, so I have many thoughts. First of all, I would say I am more of an Aristotelian than a Nietzschean or Sartrean myself. I do think humans have definite natures that are rooted in biology. They're not perfect natures, though. They haven't reached some sort of apogee. And there are numerous flaws in human nature, because I am also an atheist and materialist, and I think we evolved from lower order life forms, and we evolved in a context where life was indeed nasty, brutish, and short. To survive, people grouped together in tribes of about 100 to 150 people. They were exceptionally insular and hostile to outsiders. Anything outside the tribe was a threat. They developed a large number of heuristics, cognitive biases, instincts, which were to some extent conducive to short-term survival and reproduction in that environment, but may be deeply counterproductive to the modern technological world in which we find ourselves. But I think, to Grayson's main point, there's not nearly as much of a bright line as he tries to portray between technologies that, let's say, restore something that is broken and technologies that provide some sort of augmentation. Because, look, I can show you what an unbroken person looks like at 120. He probably looks somewhat like Grayson. So if Grayson looked this way at 120, he cannot say he doesn't have a referent to himself, because really the transhumanist project would be, if he chose it, he could stay exactly the same biologically as he is now. Nobody is forcing him to become a chimeric organism and get the DNA of other species transplanted into him, or change his phenotype in any manner. Really, the basic project of transhumanism is to empower people, if they so choose, to remain biologically young and healthy and functional in ways that people who are biologically young, healthy, and functional are today. The issue is, I think Grayson may make an artificial distinction between disease of the sort that he has described, like, say, kidney disease or cancer, and aging. And he thinks that aging is somehow natural, built into the fabric of reality, whereas for transhumanists, aging is just another, some would call it disease, some would call it a degenerative condition, some would call it a treatable medical condition. But the fact is, aging results from the accumulation of damage, just like other diseases, at the cellular and molecular level. Those types of damage are already known. They have been identified by various scientists, but it was Aubrey de Grey in the year 2000 who formulated a comprehensive taxonomy of 7 main types of aging-related damage, and others have categorize them differently, but it's essentially the same universe of damage. So when you read about, say, the hallmarks of aging from the famous 2013 paper that was then updated a decade later, now they have 12 hallmarks of aging, but it's the same universe of damage that is known. So the question is, if we can treat an injury, a fracture, if we can treat heart disease, if we can treat kidney disease? Why not treat this damage at a cellular and molecular level, just using somewhat more advanced technologies than we have currently? And really, again, there's no bright line, because in the 19th, there was a controversy about anesthesia. There was a controversy about vaccination. Well, there still is now, but there was a much wider controversy in the medical establishment, because some people were saying, well, if you got sick, or if your injury was so bad that you would be screaming in pain from any surgical intervention, that was God's will. In the early 20th century, people would say, well, if you got sick with cancer, that was God's will. That was a sign that you were essentially on the way out. Sorry, good to know you, but you're going to die.
Well, I think those people were simply wrong. Like, I don't want to be associated with those positions, because I think they're contrary to any, normal understanding of natural law theory.
Yes.
Well, specifically what Grayson was pointing out, Gennady, had to do, let's say, with the example of whether it's birth control, or even, let's say, more of a dire situation, which would be the hormones that were given to, young people to change how their body would have naturally been. So that, I think, would be a great example of the kind of intervention that would go in the way of how the human body would have naturally worked itself out. So where do you stand when it comes to that kind of transhumanism?
Yes. So transhumanism does uphold the concept of morphological freedom, which is the idea that people should have the choice of essentially what happens to their bodies, as long as they don't violate the rights of others. And there are, of course, ethical considerations involved, as in, is this intervention actually going to achieve what it's intended to achieve? So there's a difference between saying, I want to transform something about myself in a real way, versus saying, well, I just declare it to be so. There's a difference, because I think on the one hand, transhumanism finds an affinity with people who, let's say they suffer from gender dysphoria and they want to change something about their bodies to feel essentially more in tune with their essence as they identify it. I'm not going to say, and it's not my place to say, that they shouldn't do that. If it improves their quality of life, their agency, their ability to become the best versions of themselves,
Sure.
I would say they should have the right to go for it. But on the other hand, we had a virtual enlightenment salon recently where we talked, there's a community of people who identify as trans age. And what does that mean? On the one hand, I think many of us transhumanists would like to be biologically younger than we are, but we know we can't just declare it. I can't declare myself to be an 18-year-old and be an 18-year-old. I would have to actually undergo procedures that don't exist yet for biological age reversal. So I think there's a difference between aspiration and reality. And again, we do have biological natures that need to be respected. I do agree with Francis Bacon when he said nature to be commanded must be obeyed. There are definitive physical laws, chemical laws, biological laws, and pathways toward getting to a certain outcome. Yes. So we're not that far apart in this regard. I just think you draw certain lines that may be more culturally specific or based on what you are let's say familiar with or comfortable with, because you see the effects of those procedures all around us. People have open heart surgery, people go under anesthesia, and they come out all right. They come out better because they're cured of their conditions. But you don't see these emerging technologies, the next generation of advances. But somebody 25 years from now in your position might still call himself an anti-transhumanist and say, oh, these gene therapies, stem cell therapies are okay, living to 120 and looking like people at, say, 60 you used to look like at 120, that's fine. But the next generation of advances, whatever they are, nanorobots, that's crossing the line. So I think this is culturally and situationally specific. And really the line is really what is prevalent in the status quo. And some people want to go beyond that. Some people have reservations. Some people are reacting against it.
Well, I think that I'll readily admit that when it comes to transhumanism, and perhaps this puts me a bit on the back foot here, since radical life extension is sort of your central point, that is one of the elements of technology that I'm sort of most uncertain about, in that I just don't know how far life extension can be carried with technologies that I would consider licit. This is not something it's something I address in the book. It's not something I dwell on at very great length, because right now it's still so very hypothetical. We still have not yet succeeded in radically extending the human lifespan beyond where it has ended historically. Fewer people live to their 90s, but people have always lived to their 90s, and that's about, or even to 100, and that's about as long as you can expect to live now, even with the medical care that we have. So it's a bridge that I'll cross when I'll come to it. My sort of lodestar, though, just for now, is that I don't think the desire for immortality is a noble one. I think it is a petty and grasping and ignoble way to approach life. I think that we move through life in stages. We are children, we're parents, we're grandparents. We take our place on the stage of life, we move through it, and then we kind of mentor others as they come up, and then we make our exit to go to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, right? This is kind of my guiding light, but like I said, this is all still so very hypothetical at this point. I wanted to weigh in on what you talked about with nature and you being an atheist materialist, because this was kind of what I prepared for my opening statement, but I'll do it now since we're well past opening statements. There's basically two arguments one can mount against transhumanism. I try to do both in my book. I should hold my book up and keep talking.
Yeah. And it's in the description, by the way, for you guys. If you want to buy this book, the link is in the description. Sophia Publishing. And go there. And by the way, while I have the floor, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button right now. Anyway, Grayson, go for it.
Sure. So you can make sort of a moral and religious argument, which is that, the core insight of the human race, of all great religious and philosophical traditions, is that there is some transcendent order to the cosmos, and that man is a part of it, does not stand altogether outside of it, that by virtue of his reason, he's able to engage with it in ways that, inanimate creation and the beasts are not, but that we are still a part of this cosmic order in some sense. In the Old Testament, there's the word chokmah is used both for skill and wisdom, right? It describes the wise man of Proverbs. It also describes a stonecutter who helps build the tabernacle in Exodus. There is an art to living as a human the same way there is an art to carving marble properly. And you wouldn't treat marble and granite the same way, because they are different things of different natures, in the same way that you are a type of being with a particular nature and ought to act in a way in accordance with it. To not do that is not just wrong morally in some sense. It's actually foolish because it leads you toward self-destruction. Aristotle thought this, King Solomon thought this, Confucius and Lao Tzu thought this, Jesus Christ and St. Paul thought this. And I think we discard that, central unifying idea of human religious and philosophical history at our peril, because transhumanists don't believe in this. Transhumanists take this Darwinist atheist materialist view, which is that we are the product, as Gennady was saying, of kind of blind physical forces that exercise no claim to our deference. There is no ought attached to the is of the kind of being that we are. Existence precedes essence, as Sartre said. The only meaning of life is to give your life a meaning. The world becomes this meaningless void on which the will imposes itself. And like I said, you can talk about Nietzsche, you can talk about Sartre. I think this goes back to the Garden of Eden. This is ye shall be as gods. This is you can create your own cosmic order. You can reject the one that exists objectively and create your own. You can have the power and the immortality you desire apart from a relationship with your creator and apart from conforming yourself to the existing cosmic order. And so, yeah, I think that Gennady kind of was we were going back and forth on Twitter before this, and he mentioned I said transhumanism was Luciferian, and he mentioned the existence of something called the Christian Transhumanist Society. But given everything I've said, I think that the idea of being a Christian transhumanist is an absurdity that can only be uttered from the profoundest depth of theological ignorance. I think it's a fundamentally Luciferian project, and I think as evidence we saw just in the past week, transgenderism is a subset of transhumanism, as Gennady kindly mentioned, more part of a morphological freedom. I've got this book here, From Transgender to Transhuman by Martin Rothblatt, in which that's the central thesis of the book, that transgenderism is sort of an early down payment on the transhumanist future we can hope for. And I'm sure all the viewers have seen, I'm sure you've all seen the sketches in the shooter's notebook, the transgender shooter's notebook, who shot all those children at mass at a Catholic school, where one of the doodles showed the shooter looking in a mirror with a demonic figure looking back at him, and with Cyrillic words in the, I'm not demonizing the people who use Cyrillic alphabets, of course. I'm in good
Well,
company
speaking
here.
with demons, a lot of that is also Order of the Night Angles, that whole cult group online with the Discord
appeared to be
grooming.
having a conversation with a demonic being in these Cyrillic messages saying, like, do it, I don't want to do it, and things like that. So I think there you see a pretty direct line, whether you believe in the demonic or not, from this rejection of cosmic order, this deification of the individual will, running straight through to this nihilistic and destructive impulse.
I really want Neil
Now,
to
part
get
two
into
is
it
my
as well.
practical argument.
Yes.
I want to let Gennady respond to my moral and religious argument against
and then Neil, and then I want Neil to get into this as well with the daimons.
Let them go back and forth.
Okay.
I'll push back on this. First of all, on the particular shooter at the Catholic school, there is absolutely no evidence that this individual was a transhumanist. He may have harbored demonic...
He was transgender. Of course he was a transhumanist.
Not all transgender people are transhumanists or identify as such. So transgenderism and transhumanism are not identical or co-equal. One is not a subset of the other. It is just that transhumanists would support the right of transgender people to exercise their morphological freedom, and various transgender people who think in sophisticated ways about their agency and morphological freedom would find affinity in transhumanism. But that doesn't mean that every transgender person is an advocate of transhumanism or somehow reflects upon transhumanism.
I hate to cut you off, but I don't see how transgenderism could not be considered a subset of transhumanism. It's the application of technology to assert one's will over one's biology in a way that's extrinsic to one's kind of natural human flourishing.
But it depends on
fundamental alterations to one's biology in this way. I think it's textbook.
It depends on how conscientiously one is seeking to assert one's will and for what purpose. If it is for the purpose of self-improvement, becoming a truer, more authentic version of oneself, then that could be a manifestation of transhumanism. But if it stems from, as I believe was the case for this shooter, from a confusion or from underlying mental health issues or from an impulse to lash out at the world. Like there are some people who I would say embrace transgenderism not out of, let's say, a genuine desire to become their true selves, but maybe because it's fashionable or maybe because they see it as a way to lash out. And I would say that's a very different person from a transgender person who is thinking about it in serious philosophical terms. But that person was just deranged. And there are deranged people of every demographic. There are deranged heterosexual, cisgender, Caucasian males, and that shouldn't be an indictment of heterosexual, cisgender, Caucasian males. I'm sure we would all agree with that. So I don't want to use one example of a person who did something terrible to tarnish an entire demographic and to tarnish another philosophy that if you were to draw a Venn diagram, there would be two circles with an overlap. But that deranged killer might have been outside both circles, to be honest. He was just in his own bizarre world. But I want to also display this book, Death is Wrong.
Death is Wrong.
And
Also in the description, by the way, for you guys to buy.
So one of the images is this one of Alan Harrington. He is one of the philosophers cited in the book, and he wrote, "We must never forget that we are cosmic revolutionaries, not stooges conscripted to advance a natural order of things that kills everybody." So Grayson was making the case
I'm with
for
you. That's the textbook Luciferian argument. Yeah.
Well, it's not a Luciferian argument. It's a humanitarian argument and a humane
Lucifer
argument.
was the
Because
first humanitarian, my friend.
If you consider what this natural order entails, 99.9% of all species, I'm not even talking about individuals, I'm talking about species, are now extinct. And I wouldn't be able to envision, and I don't think even, say, Putin or Xi, if they were to design a natural order, would create brain-eating parasites that lay their larvae inside the brains of more complex creatures. There is so much death, destruction, suffering, predation in this so-called natural order that, yes, it has existed, though it hasn't been a static order. It hasn't been like the medieval great chain of being where every entity has its own place. No, it's a vicious war of all against all, where essentially, yes, evolution happens, natural selection happens. Just because we acknowledge that it happens doesn't mean we ascribe normative value to it. We don't think it's a great thing that this kind of natural selection happens. We believe, as transhumanists, that there's a better way to approach evolution, that we should take charge of evolution and become the stewards of life in the cosmos, or at least life that is perhaps less advanced than we are, so that we can achieve better outcomes, not just for ourselves, but for other creatures. There are transhumanist philosophers like David Pearce, whose project is the eventual abolition of all suffering. So there is a concern for non-human animals as well, and maybe sometime they might even be uplifted and be, let's say, raised to a level of sentience that we currently enjoy. But the idea that just because something is natural, then it is good, that is something that transhumanists recoil against. Yes, nature exists.
Well, this is a fundamental understanding of what's meant by nature, though. There's a difference between how this term is used in classical Aristotelian philosophy and how it's used sort of casually today. Today, by natural, we mean what happens absent outside interference. So if I plant an acorn in stunted soil, in a poor soil, and the tree grows up stunted, and I don't do anything to interfere with its growth, and it becomes a sickly, twisted tree, that's considered to be natural today. That's what happened naturally, right? Because I didn't interfere with it. Aristotle would take the exact opposite view. Nature is something, fulfilling, becoming what it is, right? It's fulfilling its telos, its proper end. So if I plant an acorn and it grows up stunted because the soil is poor, that's unnatural. It has failed to achieve its telos. If I go in and I fertilize that soil around it, I am helping it advance toward its true nature. So I think this is a really cheap shot that transhumanists come at.
Wait, but what if you selectively breed it? Like, let's say with cannabis, for instance. Nowadays, cannabis producers have been able to create these kind of strains that, allegedly they don't even give you the red eyes, they don't give you a headache, and they're super potent, they're super powerful. So would that be fulfilling the telos of the ideal cannabinoid?
Well, I don't think there's a problem with, using our creativity to selectively breed plants together and create ones with new virtues and potencies. Necessarily, I might quibble with whether marijuana is,
but not so much with people having new kind of potencies. Because I understand what you're getting at, Grayson, and I do agree a lot with what you have to say. I think it's a cheap shot to say, like, oh, well, cancer is natural, so I guess you can't cure cancer. That's totally alien to any natural law understanding. The most important thing, I think, where we can definitely agree on here is trying to undo the harm that people might inevitably do onto each other, which I think is kind of the point that we're missing here when we're going into life extension, which I think already you guys do agree with. So I'll give you guys an example of a story real quick.
Sure. Sorry.
So a surgeon who amputated limbs for a living and froze his own legs in dry ice so he could get them amputated to fulfill his sexual desires. So this was a recent story, and the guy got sued because I think he tried to take money out of insurance or something like that for doing that.
Sure.
Very similar to this furry who got his hands amputated because he wanted to turn them into like furry paws. So my question for both of you guys is that an objective good for those people? Because if we're talking about telos, wouldn't they consider that to be a good?
Gennady said earlier, they had this caveat of this if, right? Like if, we support the right of people to transition if it's out of a desire to become their true self, but not if it's out of confusion. I would say it's always out of confusion, but that's beside the point. That if there makes Gennady quite the moderate, I think, within the larger movement. If you read Andrea Long Chu, who's a famous transgender writer, male to female transgender writer, who, I know we've argued about this already, but I think would definitely qualify as a transhumanist, whether he identifies as such or not. My whole thing is not caring how people identify, right? But Chu specifically says, I believe that desire and happiness are independent agents, that I don't think anyone should be allowed to tell me I can't mutilate my genitals, even if they know it will make me miserable. Chu says, I wanted to take my own life more after I transitioned than before I transitioned. And I still don't regret still don't think I should have been stopped from transitioning because I wanted it. It's my will, it's my desire. And biology is not to stand in the way of that. The idea that desire and happiness could point in opposite directions, is, from any Aristotelian perspective, a sign of a horribly disordered will, right? The good man's will is that which points toward his telos, toward his eudaimonia, toward his flourishing. If your will is pointing in the exact opposite direction, there's something in the exact opposite direction of the flourishing that's proper to you as the kind of being that you are deeply, deeply disordered. But that's the idea underlying basically all of transhumanism.
No, quite the contrary. So I'm not going to support any kind of exercise of will that is aimed at self-destruction or pleasure for the sake of pleasure.
Don't you support assisted suicide?
No, I do not.
Your party has a plank that does. I apologize.
So it's not the way you interpret it. So let me clarify what the plank is, and I can actually pull it up. This is a plank that supports the legal autonomy of people to self-administer life-ending medications in a situation where they are terminally ill, and at least two medical professionals have essentially signed off on that, but it is specifically opposed to assisted suicide. I'll read it.
And it's to end suffering. It's to end suffering.
I think that is assisted suicide.
Yeah, but it's to end suffering, though. People are suffering. It's like they have like months to live, and they're in insane pain because they.
I know what it's for. I know what it is. I'm still opposed to it.
So this is what it says. So let's set a common context, and you can disagree with it. I have some reservations about it myself, but this is what it says. The United States Transhumanist Party supports the autonomy of an individual to decide on the continuation of that individual's own life, including the right to choose or not to choose life-extending medical treatments. The United States Transhumanist Party does not consider it practicable or desirable for suicide to be illegal, but discourages suicide from a moral standpoint, and furthermore considers that the legal right of suicide should only pertain to the individual and should not extend to any euthanasia or direct administration of a life-ending substance or procedure by any other person. The United States Transhumanist Party has grave concerns with anybody but the individual acting to hasten the end of that individual's life. Although each individual should be free to decide upon the duration of his, her, or its own life, the United States Transhumanist Party supports cultural changes and discussions that would encourage all individuals to undertake life-prolonging choices and activities. Advances in medical technology would facilitate more open-ended lifespans and would enable individuals to choose either finite or indefinite lengths of their lives. However, if individuals are recognized as having this autonomy, the United States Transhumanist Party is interested in persuading as many people as possible to decide to preserve their irreplaceable lives instead of hastening their end. With regard to any legalization of assisted suicide or measures to provide patients with life-ending prescriptions, the United States Transhumanist Party supports stringent legal safeguards to ensure that each individual patient's choice with regard to such matters is entirely free and uncoerced, and that there is no steering of any particular individual toward a life-ending choice by family members, medical practitioners, health insurers, activists, or any other individual or organization standing to benefit financially from the end of a patient's life. However, efforts to persuade an individual to prolong his, her, or its life should not be restricted. The United States Transhumanist Party opposes the emergence of any financially motivated lobby or industry whose primary business model would be assisted suicide or euthanasia, as the existence of such a lobby could create incentives and policies to steer people toward life-ending choices, including through legislation that might favor such so-called choices in not quite voluntary situations. Instead, any prescription for a life-ending substance should only be provided as an incidental service by a patient's primary care physician with the express written consent of at least one other unaffiliated physician, and the substance in question should only be allowed to be self-administered by the patient directly after a predefined time period since the obtaining of the prescription. Once the substance is prescribed, no medical practitioner should be permitted to benefit financially based on any specific choice of the patient to self-administer the substance to end the patient's life. This position should not be construed to restrict any non-financially motivated political advocacy on the subject of assisted suicide, which involves individuals expressing their views on the subject in a public forum when those individuals do not stand to gain financially from others choosing to obtain a life-ending substance. So this is really a very limited plank. It's saying if a person is in this terminally ill situation, really wants to end their own life, we realize it's not practical to prohibit suicide, and we'd rather that this person exercise that choice in a peaceful and dignified manner rather than go out with a bang, so to speak.
Well, this is where I think there's a certain naivete to transhumanism, though, is that all of those caveats with which you've hedged about your plank were all present in Canada, for example, and we've seen the slippery slope that's taken place there. So this is something that, it always comes in with this very limited, like, oh, it'll just be in these very dire cases, which I wouldn't even support it in those cases. But here's all the safeguards we're going to put in place. And everywhere it's tried, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Canada, especially has been in the news. All these abuses creep in inevitably. There's always a slide toward this thing. Which kind of brings me to my second point. So I made my moral and religious case against transhumanism. I didn't mean to sort of hang my whole hat on the Minnesota shooting. That was just sort of a rhetorical flourish at the end of my natural law argument. But if you don't buy any of that, then I have sort of the practical argument, which is that Gennady, you seem like a very nice person, but I don't know that I trust you more than I trust the blind, unguided forces of evolution to produce a greater degree of flourishing and to give me what's best for me.
You don't think I could avoid killing 99.9% of all species? I mean, that's what the blind, unguided forces of evolution have done. I wouldn't do that. Putin wouldn't do that. Well,
you can't do that. Killing a species is not something you can do to me. I think all species will go extinct over time. But regardless, you talk about Xi and Putin, like we can all imagine easily the horrors that would result if transhumanist technologies fell into the hands of these dictators. The Soviets talked openly about their desire to produce a new Soviet man, right? This was explicitly their intention. And now obviously they wanted to do it through social engineering, through creating a society that would produce different values in people. But if they had had access to gene editing technology, to advanced neuropharmacology, to all of these other things, do you think they would have not tried to produce a population that was better suited to their totalitarian goals? Do you think they would have not tried to produce a population that was more docile, for example, and less likely to rebel and more
Wait,
likely
sorry,
to...
I must insist on quoting this over here. So Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, 1870 to 1932, was a Soviet biologist specializing in artificial insemination, and he proposed creating a human-ape hybrid, often called Human Z, and his plan was to artificially inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm and potentially inseminate women with ape sperm. Although this idea was even more controversial. So there you go. There's an example of a Soviet dictatorship, and the new Soviet man.
But I think that we make the mistake of thinking, here in America, we have freedom and that wouldn't happen. We would be free to apply these technologies to ourselves in ways that would maximize our chosen conceptions of our own flourishing. That is not the case. You and I will not control this technology. It will be in the hands of massive medical, pharma companies, medical technology companies, Silicon Valley, big tech. They will not have your best interests at heart. They will have shareholder value at heart. And they will be armed with enormous lobbying war chests to prevent restrictions of this technology. If you are wondering how that might look at right now when teen self-unaliving, I suppose, gotta use circumlocutions here on the stream, spikes, and that just happens to coincide with the year that every middle schooler got a smartphone. And yet, have we seen a ban on smartphones for minors yet? No, of course not. They're demonstrably harming them. They're making their lives worse in every measurable way. And yet, NetChoice is throwing billions and billions of dollars at Congress and at state legislatures across the country to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I think the same thing would happen as more explicitly transhumanist technologies become available. You won't truly have this free choice, in a vacuum of whether or not to adopt these technologies, because the culture, the state, and the market will all have the ability to exert pressures on you to alter and augment yourselves in ways that they find profitable and more convenient. Men are lengthening their legs because the Tinder algorithm has warped demand in the dating marketplace to favor taller men in a way that it wouldn't have, in a more pronounced way than it did before. Women feel pressure to take birth control because if you are not taking birth control, you have to be a little more choosy about when you sleep with guys, and you forfeit a competitive advantage in the dating marketplace. These are just very minor examples, but you can imagine how this would go forward. One example I use in the book, imagine you have an implant in your brain that gives you kind of a constant augmented reality feed, right? A virtual overlay atop your sense perceptions. Now imagine, you're in this surreal Twilight Zone episode where you're walking down a street in a city and there's signs everywhere, on the stores, on the road, everywhere, and they are all blank because it's been decided that market's been saturated. 99% of everyone has adopted these implants in their head. And now it's no longer cost effective to replace or repaint signs. You just have someone update the text box. You can now not participate in society. You cannot drive. You don't know what kind of store you're outside of. You cannot navigate by sight. You have basically no choice but to augment yourself, to make yourself transhuman, or to be excluded from society. Imagine a world where we get an artificial womb. It's not going to simply be the case that it's a take or leave proposition. We'll very quickly reach a stage where when a pregnant woman walks down the street, people won't smile at her. They'll hiss at her and recoil from her and regard her as a religious fanatic or someone who's needlessly endangering herself and her baby. This is what I mean.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know about that. Maybe.
Yeah, I would disagree with that prognosis. Now, we do favor artificial wombs in the Transhumanist Party, and actually one major reason is that they would render the abortion controversy obsolete, because then
this is my point, though.
Currently irreconcilable rights, the right of a fetus to life, which I actually think is a real right, and the right of a woman to choose whether or not to continue the pregnancy could be reconciled. If a woman chooses not to continue the pregnancy, then the fetus could simply be relocated into an artificial womb and then
and I quote this, but I quote this in my book though. Feminists oppose artificial. Some feminists oppose artificial womb technology for this exact reason, because you could terminate your pregnancy and still be left with a live baby, and they don't want that. The point is not to evict an invader into your womb. The point is actually to avoid parenthood. They want the baby dead.
That's not a legitimate desire. That's not a legitimate desire.
I'm glad we agree on that. I'm glad we agree on that.
Autonomy of another being. And furthermore,
but I actually so here's my point though, is to go back to, you're accusing me, you say that I draw lines artificially. I think that I actually have a pretty good, test for where I draw the lines. Take artificial wombs, for example. There are today, we have lots of situations where a woman goes into labor before her unborn child has reached the point of viability. And that is a death sentence for that baby. There's other situations where a woman's life is threatened by her pregnancy and the doctors have to induce labor. Even in Catholic bioethics, that's considered licit because you're not intending to kill the unborn child. You're intending to save the mother's life. You're treating them both as patients. The baby's death, while foreseeable, is not intended and is a tragic byproduct of saving the mother's life. Artificial wombs could help us avoid those tragic situations. Unfortunately, we have lost the teleological understanding of medicine that would enable us to draw that line there and say we're going to use these for this purpose, but we are not going to use them to replace normal human reproduction. And they would very quickly, you probably think this is a good thing, but they would very quickly become universal because we've seen this pattern with other technologies. Like I said, you don't simply have an easy choice to opt out of these things because of the way that this social process plays out. Look at internet access, right? It's it comes on the scene as like a kind of plaything of geeks on Usenet, right? Then it becomes how you do work and how you do school. Now it's necessary. Now you have to have it. And we've reached the point where the government is actually funding the building out of rural broadband services to areas where it's not cost effective to build them because it's too sparsely populated. I think we would see the same thing with these transhumanist technologies where we invent the limitless pill, and for a while, the ultra rich pay $10,000 a pill for their kids. They pull way out ahead. And then eventually it's covered by insurance, and then it's, free. It's free at the point of access because otherwise it creates too much inequality. And now me and my unaugmented children are a bunch of dumbasses living on a reservation, being spat at as subhumans by you and your enlightened ilk.
We would not do that. And I think you're partially right.
I don't know if you personally would.
You're partially right in two ways. First of all, you're right in the sense that technologies come with certain incentives to adopt them. Otherwise, they wouldn't get adopted at all. So there's a way in which you are trivially correct. I think there's more substance than that to what you're saying. You're also correct in the sense that institutions can affect how technologies are utilized and whether they're used for good or for ill. So a totalitarian government in possession of surveillance technologies is not going to do good things with them. And I think there are many cases that are obvious where we could agree. I think the difference is you attribute a much more deterministic quality to the adoption of these technologies. And moreover, you underestimate the degree of pluralism and heterogeneity which will happen in a future world where these technologies become abundant. So transhumanists would support, for instance, the right of the Amish to choose which technologies they would admit into their communities and which they would reject. And the Amish are very interesting too, because they don't just confine themselves to 19th century technologies. They do look at each technology on its own terms. And for instance, they will accept a lot of modern medical technologies, but they won't accept technologies that, let's say, alter their methods of production or communal living too much. And I think it is their right to make these decisions within their communities as long as it's voluntary. I would expect.
But the late stage atomized liberal political ideology that gives rise, I think, to transhumanism, within which transhumanism is an intelligible idea, is the same ideology that takes an acid bath to intermediate institutions, that hollows out the extended family, the local community, the state, i.e., any community that could come together and make intentional decisions about how to use technology, what technologies to adopt. I mean, I think you're overestimating how much agency and how much willpower the atomized individual really has. I mean, just look at individual nuclear families and how smartphones are tearing them apart, and how parents don't feel they have the agency to control their own children's use of technology, or even control their own use of technology. Everyone says they use their phones more than they want to, because these are devices that are designed to biohack our dopamine systems and strip mine them for profit. And we are being given no protection against this because of how powerful and wealthy and well-connected in lobbying circles these companies are. And I don't see any reason that things would go much better. You know, smartphones are stage one, right? They have this kind of discarnating effect on us, but they're not, you know, we're not in transhumanist territory with these. They're dipping a toe, and we've already seen what they're doing to people.
So we've never, by the way, I do have some observations on smartphones and, let's say, the adaptations that humans have undertaken for them. But we've never, as transhumanists, stated we want to dismantle any intermediary institutions. We're not against families, schools, churches. We're not against third spaces, social clubs, whatever institutions exist that can shape the culture for the better. Indeed, we would rather prefer a decentralized network of voluntary institutions to a top-down imposition of one size fits all, because we know that one size isn't going to fit all. But in terms of smartphones, I have noticed an evolution in terms of people's norms around them. In, say, 2002, Grayson, you're probably too young to remember this. People had these phones that weren't quite today's smartphones, but they had cell phones, many of them for the first time, that weren't tied to a particular place. So if they were, say, in a cafe or a restaurant and they got a call, they would drop immediately what they were doing. They would pick it up and start talking to the person on the phone instead of the person in front of them. And this was a habit that was acquired from the days of landline phones, where I even remember this. If you didn't pick up the phone right then, many phones didn't even have voicemail, so you wouldn't know who called you or what they were going to say. So that habit persisted. It took maybe a decade for people to shift their habits so that they recognize, you can let this call go to voicemail, or if you don't recognize the number, don't pick it up. So the way people approach calls on smartphones is much more reasonable today, given the technology. There are other features of smartphones, the endless feeds, the social media algorithms that do tend to be designed to entrap people, that do, in my view, lead to suboptimal coping mechanisms. And children in particular are vulnerable to this. Do I believe this means children should be banned from using phones or social media? No. I think children should be taught good habits of using phones and social media, constructive skills. Just like any other technology, a smartphone is a tool, and the internet is a tool. It can be used for good. It can be used for ill. Let's say pornographic sites have existed on the internet ever since the internet came to be. Would you have advocated for banning children from using the internet in the 1990s or early 2000s because, they could find a pornographic site? Well, I would advocate
banning those pornographic sites.
Well, we would
perhaps drone striking their headquarters.
We would disagree there because, I was coming of age during that time. I did not go to a single pornographic site on the internet because I could have. I just didn't have a desire to, because I had more interesting ways in which I could use the internet. I saw it as a tool of individual liberation.
Okay, well, I mean, the did I mention I was okay thing comes off a little callous, though, when you consider how many thousands and millions of people are being destroyed by pornography. The fact that you didn't feel that particular temptation is very convenient for you. But when you look at people who are suffering from erectile dysfunction, people who are finding themselves unable to form loving relationships, when you see people who are finding themselves drawn into darker and more disturbing content that they then attempt to enact on their sexual partners. Like, this is all stuff that is very bad for the common good. And I think it's sort of just very, very blithe and dismissive to say like, oh, well, that's a decision for each individual to make. I think that these things have social effects, and that we ought to believe that there are higher goods than simple individual autonomy to choose anything or reject anything freely. I think there's certain things that are objectively harmful, that are objectively addictive, that are objectively prurient, and I'm totally fine with rejecting those kinds of things.
Well, I think that is the role of culture. And I'll just say this briefly before.
Well, this is, people always say this is the role of culture, and then their ideology is the very one that takes an acid bath to this culture. Like, I appreciate you saying, like, we're not opposed to intermediate institutions, but I feel like this is a disconnect we're having where I keep saying, like, here's how I think this will play out. You know, here's what I think will be the consequences of this, intended or unintended. And you just say, oh, well, we wouldn't intend that. And it's like, that doesn't make it better when we live in transhumanist dystopia.
We have agency to prevent it through non-coercive means, through education. That's why we have the virtual enlightenment salons every week at the Transhumanist Party. We discuss these kinds of ideas, and we discuss governance, culture, aesthetics, institutions. I would say even to a greater extent than we discuss technology, because those are the areas where we have more agency.
I think we have less agency than you think we do. You know, I've thought more deeply about this than most people do. I still find myself using my phone more than I'd like to, for example. I think most people in their use of technology are not part of an intentional community like the Amish that's going to weigh each new technology and think about how it will affect their lifestyle and promote their values. People simply adopt what they can afford, what they find pleasurable, what their neighbors have, and what makes them better able to keep up with their friends and coworkers and compete in the job economy while remaining culturally relevant. That's how people make these decisions.
To be fair to Gennady, though, I think that, Gennady, you're coming from a place of nobility where you want to bring out the very best in people.
Yes,
but it comes back to the whole is-ought conundrum, where what is, meaning this state where people tend to want to rest as opposed to work, unless there's some kind of a brand in there behind, you know, kind of like getting them excited and you know, kind of forcing them to apply themselves. I think most people, how we got to the position that we're in today with the civilization, a lot of it has been fighting against this short, violent, and brutish life and trying to make the best of things. But when those pressures are not there anymore, I think that's kind of what, Grayson, you're getting at. That when we don't have these pressures, when we allow technology to just facilitate whatever desire we happen to have, as noble as a desire you may have, Gennady, towards the betterment of humanity, it almost seems like the 300 Spartans, you know, standing against this coming wave of people just wanting to have instant gratification. And
well, I don't know
how much can you? Yeah,
I'm not sure what Gennady means by betterment is the other thing. You know, he's someone who has cut himself off from the idea of transcendent cosmic order, from what C.S. Lewis called the Tao.
That's like a whole other level that I want to get to. Sure,
it's his whim. It's his definition.
But it's not my whim. It's
okay.
It's based in my biological survival. So I would say me living the good life, there are gradations of it, of course, but let's say I'm 120 years old and I'm otherwise physically, materially in the exact situation that I am now, have the exact same life routines. I would take that. I would say that's a good life, maybe not a perfect life. We're all flawed. I may be using my phone a bit too often myself. That doesn't mean on net it's not a good life. And it doesn't mean it can't be better. So perhaps I could read more books. I could appreciate more art. I could listen to or compose more music. I could learn more history. I could see more places in the world. I could see other worlds. I could see the future of the human species. I could contribute to the future of the human species. All of these are manifestations. And if we're talking about telos, so I think Grayson distinguishes nature in the way I have used it, which is what happens in the natural world, versus this Aristotelian telos, which is what is the purpose or the potential of an entity which could be actualized, but it isn't always actualized. So I have two observations about that. First of all, for most entities, their telos isn't actualized in that way because of nature in the way I've described it in the more Hobbesian sense of that term. But furthermore, we humans, if we think about what is our telos, throughout the history of our species, whatever you think of the origins of the human species, whether it's through evolution, through our sequential harnessing of tools like fire or, say, stone implements or writing, or if you think of Adam and what Adam did in the Garden of Eden, the telos of humans is to overcome the limitations they find themselves with. So even if you take the biblical story, well, what did Adam do? He sought the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, which was the one fruit he wasn't supposed to have, but that was within his nature as a human to seek that fruit. So I don't see that as bad, and I don't see rejecting that as somehow, let's say, finding one's telos. No, I see that as crippling humans from doing that which humans do best.
Well, do you not see? Okay, do you not see though that taking this definition that man is the reaching being, man is the striving being, man is the being that defines itself, just abolishes the idea of teleology? Like a teleology is rooted in a specific nature. If you turn man's nature into a null, there can be no telos. It does become based purely in whim. It does become based purely in subjective preference.
A lot of
now what you have preferences, certainly, that perhaps, you know, peace is better than war, and aesthetic appreciation is better than slop, and life is better than death. But these are all based in your will and your preference, because of your definition of man. I want to make just like one more point to circle back to what we were saying earlier, where I think that the question of agency is really what it comes down to here. I think that while you're having your salons and while you're trying to build a culture that can responsibly engage with technologies according to your definition of responsibility, we're on the transhumanist dystopia express, and the brake lines have been cut. Picture just simply, this is a purely consensual transaction, right? Imagine there's some kind of neurological tweak that makes employees more productive, perhaps even makes your life somewhat less pleasant, let's say, but makes you more productive at work. And employers just say on their job applications, like, unaugmented need not apply, right? We want someone who has this augmentation, right? It's your choice not to get it, right? It's not discrimination based on some intrinsic characteristic you can't fix, like skin color. In the same way that if you refuse to use a computer or a smartphone, some companies might not hire you today. But this could be a tweak to your own biology. And that's not even to touch the issue of consumerism, where we already are in this very consumerist society where we define ourselves and define our identity by what we consume. But you buy a new shirt and it's like, a whole new me. I got this shirt. I'm gonna show up in this shirt and be a cool guy in my new shirt. Now imagine they can sell you a new genome, a new set of eyes, a new personality, a new pair of genitals. We're already doing that a little bit now. It will really precipitate, I think, you talk about pluralism, on one hand, I'm sure there will be pluralism and uniformity mixed, right? Everyone has a smartphone, but people make different choices about what shirts they buy. In the same way, I'm sure people will make different choices about how they use transhumanist technology on themselves, but in the spheres in which there is pluralism, it'll really precipitate this unending identity crisis where people continually apply these technologies themselves due to pressures from advertising and the surrounding culture and peer pressure and other things in the search for some kind of authentic self, which is a moving target, which is an ever receding aim that you can never reach. And I think that when people sort of scream out to the universe, who am I? Society less and less offers an answer to that. And I think that as we embrace transhumanist technologies, the answer will more and more just be, whatever you choose, and we'll help you choose. And I don't think people are going to find that satisfying. I think people are going to find that deeply unsatisfying and disturbing and eventually maddening.
Well, I think it depends
and my
on how
final
they pursue
concern,
it.
let me just make one more point. My final concern is that by admitting these transhumanist technologies, you give society permission to become as inhuman as it wants to be. The best line in Ted Kaczynski's manifesto was that once we shaped social institutions to fit humanity, in the future, we will shape humans to fit social institutions. Just to take an easy example that we already see, antidepressants, right? There's a debate over how well antidepressants work, but let's say they work great. Let's say we make one that's perfect. Society can now become so much worse, so much more inhuman, so much more abusive toward people, so much less fitted toward fulfilling their needs. Because when people look around and they see no beauty around them, they see no prospects of owning a home or getting a wife or having children or finding fulfilling work, they can simply pop this pill. And a society in which, decades ago people would have revolted can now continue turning the ratchet up infinitely, which kind of diffuses the argument from earlier that there's a limit on how abusive an immortal dictator could get. If you arm that immortal dictator with these technologies, he can simply create a population that doesn't care what he does to it. And this is what David Pierce talks about, right? He holds up this example. I forget the woman's name, but he sent me this New Yorker article about this woman who has a kind of issue, an abnormality in her neurochemistry, so she's just happy all the time, and she seems to be, a good, well-adjusted citizen and a good wife and mother, and good for her. My question is, what if her husband beat her? What if her husband beat her and she's incapable of feeling anger or sorrow or distress for any amount of time, any of those feelings that might spur her to get herself out of that situation? And take that hypothetical, magnify it to the scale of society, and that's what transhumanism will get us.
So what I hold in terms of emotions, what emotions are desirable, is what I would call a correspondence view of emotions. So the good emotion or the correct emotion to experience is one that is aligned with the objective reality, with one's actual state in the world. So it would indeed be destructive to engage in so-called wireheading, where one is just stimulating pleasure centers of the brain, while in reality one's world declines and deteriorates around one and endangers one, because ultimately we are rooted in the physical world, and that world contains the prerequisites of our survival. So I would not support either a society-wide reconfiguration of emotions, or even the practice of encouraging individuals to reconfigure emotions in ways that are subjectively more pleasurable, but not aligned with the actual reality of things around them. I don't reject, by saying this, any sort of changes to human psyches or human tendencies to respond to the world, because sometimes the human responses that exist by default are misaligned. Now, on the subject of antidepressants, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I was actually going to mention that as a response to your hypothetical of, well, what if there was some sort of augmentation that made people somewhat more productive but was detrimental in other ways? Could employers require it? I am a bit skeptical about SSRIs myself. I would never take one. For some people, they seem to have certain effects that they would consider beneficial. I would never infringe upon their autonomy to choose to take them, but I would never support a system where either the government or employers mandate that people take mind-altering medications. I think this is where individual rights need to be protected. So I would say the analogy here is, in the world in which we exist, SSRIs exist. They may help some people be more productive or focused, but they have other side effects. And for some people, these are very unfortunate and tragic side effects. Nobody is mandating that people take SSRIs as a condition of being employed. And I think that's very important. Now, it's different if you have a tool that's being used on the job. Like if you are part of a telecommunications business and your applicant to a position says, well, I don't want to use phones. I don't want to use computers. I don't want to use any of the tools that you use as part of your business. That would be like saying, well, if you're a blacksmith, to use a less technologically advanced example, and somebody wants to be your apprentice blacksmith, but he says, well, I don't want to use a hammer. I don't want to use an anvil. I don't want to use a forge. I don't want to heat up anything or shape metal. Well, sorry, you're not doing the job that is described. But I would say the blacksmith shouldn't be saying, well, outside of the job at 8 p.m. at night, this is what you should be doing. Otherwise, we're not going to hire you. So there's a distinction between what the job entails and what the person's own sphere, the private individual sphere, would be. And this is where I would uphold a public-private distinction. So I think each individual has a private sphere, and transhumanists would agree, where each person is sovereign. Whether we agree with their choices or not, whether they make optimal choices or not, they have the right to make those choices. Now, there's also a public sphere, and the public sphere includes persuasion. So I could disagree with someone's choice, and I could say, well, you should really do things differently, and here's why. And you're free to do that too, and we're free to argue with one another about that. We're not free to impose our will. And likewise, somebody could say, well, I'm doing this project, and I'm hiring people to do it, and I have certain expectations, but I'm not going to tell you what you should do in your private sphere. I should just tell you, well, for this job, you need to come on time. Here are the projects you're going to be working on. Here are the tools you're going to be using. But what you do at 8 p.m. on a Sunday, that's your choice, and I'm not going to infringe upon it. And again, that's an ethical, institutional, and political series of questions that very much need to be pursued, and transhumanists are in favor of pursuing them and discussing them. We have a platform for the U.S. Transhumanist Party, which you have read, Grayson, and we are often refining it, discussing it, developing it further, where we set forth these kinds of distinctions, and we want to make sure that true individual choice is protected, not just from the standpoint of the government cannot mandate something, but even private individuals, data brokers shouldn't be able to just harvest any information about you without your consent. You should have ownership and sovereignty over your data so that you could decide whether to disclose that information or not. And I don't see how that's inconsistent with a vision of the good, or the good eventually winning out. I just don't think we need to ban any technology for the purpose of doing that. We just need better institutions. We need better thinking about institutions, and we need more informed, thoughtful adaptations to the technologies that already exist.
Well, once again, I just think you're being excessively optimistic. Like, you could, I suppose, mandate through civil rights law or something that a company not discriminate against me, but for being unaugmented, but that quickly becomes farcical if the augmentation makes people twice as productive as me. The idea that employers would hire me and would then, treat me the same and promote me the same way is crazy. Like, yes, I have freedom to refuse this augmentation, but if that means that that the only job open to me becomes janitor, that doesn't make me feel very much better.
Well,
I think that's sort of the pattern that all these other things would follow, is that they would start out as competitive advantages for people, and then eventually they would reach mass adoption to the point that the unaugmented are, living on reservations like John the Savage in Brave New World.
So that's the Gattaca scenario. And for those who don't know, the 1997 film Gattaca essentially posits this kind of stratified society where people.
Well, I'm more concerned about the point when the society ceases to be stratified. Like, there, it's sort of presented through the lens of social class, right? I'm more concerned with what happens after Gattaca, when society says this degree of inequality is unacceptable. We're going to make these technologies, these augmentations, these genetic tweaks free to everyone. And now your option is become transhuman or be relegated to the fringes of society. And most people will make that choice to become transhuman. And you probably think that's a good thing. I think that's a very bad thing, because those choices will be dictated again by economic pressures, by social pressures, and by sort of marketing and advertising. And I have no confidence that the people in control of these technologies will know what's best for us. I think that, and that's my practical case against transhumanism, is yes, humanity is not perfect. Stick with it because it works, and you have no idea what horrors beyond your comprehension might await if you hand these people the keys.
So I would say a society that can afford to make these transhuman augmentations available to everyone would also be a society that could afford not only a universal basic income, but a universal high income, where the robots, the AIs, will do what we would consider labor or at least paid work. People would still work in the sense of pursuing activities that are meaningful, projects or improvements in their communities. Like, nobody gets paid to clean up litter today, but perhaps there would be ways to achieve universal litter cleanup in that society. Caregivers do not get paid sufficiently today, but perhaps more people will choose to become caregivers if they have a universal high income to go along with it. But the idea that in order to survive, you're going to have to get some particular augmentation, other than, of course, pursuing life extension treatments. Otherwise, you'll age or you could get diseases, but hopefully people will recognize the merits of that. But other than that, let's say people recognize the merits of extending their own lives in good health, then in that society, let's not superimpose today's employment framework onto that world. It would be a world of radical abundance, at least in relative terms. So most people would be able to say, oh, if I don't like the terms with which this other entity wants to engage with me, well, I could just go take a long walk on the beach and create works of art and travel the world because I have the means to do that. And I will still lead a life that is meaningful for me. I think this goes back to something Lev was saying. So Lev thinks that unless people are pressured through, let's say, short-term survival incentives, they're going to become lazy and not achieve as much. But I think if you're always prodded, if you're always in this game that you can't win because really this is like a carrot being dangled in front of you, but you're always on the edge of survival, well, eventually you're going to...
The carrot is the female, by the way, in this scenario for the male. But yeah.
But eventually, people are going to become wise to that. They're going to say, well, this isn't working. Clearly, this is a false promise. And there are already large portions in today's society of people who have become dejected, disillusioned, antisocial as a result of this. I'm not ignorant of that fact. And I'm not ignorant of the fact that some people have adapted to modernity suboptimally because we still have these primeval brains. And by the way, we can act as good stewards to cats and other creatures who have had, let's say, a much more difficult time in the wild as compared to under human stewardship. But
don't make my cat talk, Gennady. Don't do it.
Well, Gennady, you have a cat as well, by the way.
Yes,
who's
I do.
By the way, I wish your cat the very best as far as
yes.
Yeah.
He is recovering right now from an injury, but I do think it's important to recognize.
There we go.
Yes,
Neil, you got to bring your dog on.
It's important to recognize that humans can be motivated by
Look at that.
Positive incentives, yes, by what they could achieve if they only have a bit of breathing room. And sure, I think people today who have been habituated to, say, an office job or a manual labor job, whatever it may be, if they're freed from that with a universal high income, at first they might spend 2 weeks lounging around on a beach or doing something hedonistic because that's the first thing that comes to mind for many of them. But eventually they will get tired of that. They will realize, oh, is this it? Or is there something more to life? Is there something more interesting I could be doing? I think a lot of people would come back to some sort of productive work. It would just be productive work on their own terms. The world of Star Trek is a reasonable illustration of that, where the replicators
okay,
are able to create a lot of people's material goods, but there are still larger scale projects and missions exploring the universe that people gravitate toward.
So I don't buy this for two reasons. One is we've been told that post scarcity is right around the corner for about 100 years at this point. Marx thinks that once society is fully, industrialized, everybody can work 3 hours a day and then, go hunting and fishing and write poetry in the afternoon. John Maynard Keynes says the same thing, it's only a couple decades away. We'll cut the workday in half. Hasn't happened. So I'll believe it when I see it. And then the second reason is I am just not optimistic at all that the vast majority of that any significant number of people even will choose to use unlimited leisure in any kind of noble way. Like, yes, of course, you could read Dante in the original Italian. You could, plant your vineyard and enjoy its fruits. You could do all of these things. Most people are going to smoke weed, watch porn, and eat junk food.
How long, though? Are they going to just keep doing that indefinitely or until
well,
they
if
destroy
there's
themselves?
Ozempic, if there's good strains of weed, and if there's really, and if there's VR porn that feels so real and tickles your brain so much that you never get tired of it forever.
Wait, I really want to get Neil in on this right now. There's not a good time to bring somebody as smart as Neil into this conversation, which has already been incredible. But I want to do it right now because this question of how much is enough, and this could be something that, I don't know, like for yourself, Neil, how much would be enough, you think, for you if you were to have unlimited whatever you want and not worried about having to take care of yourself if you didn't have the same drive towards knowledge, towards gnosis? Because you didn't always have the same drive towards gnosis. There was a Neil before that, and there's a Neil after that. So would the Neil before that have been able to get to who you are today without having, like that fire under your ass, so to speak?
I think Grayson's bringing up a lot of really, really good points. What do we use as an objective, like measuring stick to determine when it becomes harmful or when it becomes useful? I think I think Gennady, right? Gennady is trying to, it seems like he's being very reasonable about how to apply these things without going too far. And I do think like there's a middle ground here that I think that's what I'm trying to, as I'm listening to both of them put their arguments forth. I think they're both making a lot of good points. I'm trying to think of like a middle ground, some sort of like inner, I don't know, some sort of way to measure when it's becoming too far. You asked me like the previous self versus my self now. Well, I did have to go through some shit to become more aware of like what I'm doing with my life. I had to hit rock bottom. That's just me personally. So I do think a lot of these people who are at home eating junk food and, just kind of just going through the motions, I do think that could be the people doing that might end up hitting a rock bottom and wanting to get their lives better. So I do think every individual is different, I guess, for that question.
Yeah. If there is a rock bottom, though, but in, let's say, the transhumanist scenario, if people are provided with enough comfort in their lives, like there would have to be like an anti-comfort level for people to get to.
Yeah, that's my concern, is that with these transhumanist technologies coupled with, hedonic pursuits, there just is no bottom.
Yeah, and that is,
you just keep consuming and pleasuring yourself forever as they, strip mine you for these things, right?
And I think that's a really valid concern. Like, what kind of society are we producing with this type of thing? But like, think about like medicine. You don't like eat a whole bottle of Advil because it's medicine. You take it when you need it. You take it as prescribed. And I do think with certain regulations and how we apply these things, there could be a way of doing things that aren't harmful to society, producing the last man that Nietzsche says, the guy sitting on the couch, on Ozempic and just kind of chilling. I do think there are safe and thoughtful and responsible ways of applying these things without sort of like destroying society And I do think it does come down to the individual. People who are educated, who have spiritual or religious outlooks, are going to have a better chance at having some sort of guidance through these things than someone who doesn't.
Well, I want to give my plug. I want to, I feel obligated. That Gennady, I sympathize with your point that you say, I don't think, I don't think you quite have teleology right, but I sympathize with your point that you look at humans breaking down and dying, becoming senile, not living up to their potential in general, before all those things happen, and say, well, we're not flourishing, we're not reaching our telos. I sympathize with that. I even sympathize with the title of your book. When I engaged with it in my own book, I make this point. Death is wrong is a statement with which Jesus of Nazareth would agree. That's why he weeps at Lazarus's tomb. He knows that death is wrong. He knows that death is the result of the fall. We all feel instinctively that death is wrong, which is one reason transhumanism becomes so attractive. The beauty and the scandal of Christianity is that God becomes man, that the human and the divine are joined in the person of Jesus Christ, and that through that, our humanity, broken and flawed and finite and limited as it is, becomes the vehicle for our salvation. Christianity is a transhumanist religion. We're promised theosis. We are promised to become partakers of the divine nature, to become sons of God equal to the angels. When Satan said, "Ye shall be as gods," he wasn't lying. The lie was that can be achieved apart from a relationship with God, and in defiance of God. So
that's an interesting point.
Yes, that's my point. So Christianity is a transhumanist religion, but that transcendence is paradoxically achieved through living and suffering as a human, not by rejecting and doing violence to our humanity in this life in the interest of achieving that transcendence under our own power.
Before Neil comments, I took a little bit of time drawing this on my phone, and this I want to be part 2 right now of this conversation. This is where we are going. So you see my phone illustration over here. There's philosophy. It goes right into telos, but then there's the other branch, the Grayson Quay branch, where it goes through Christianity into telos. So these are the two different branches, and this is, I think, the crux of the discussion that I think Neil and Grayson, you guys are going to have right now, because it's a very important one to kind of figure out, because you were bringing up a lot of philosophical things having to do with ancient Greek philosophy, Grayson, in your book, while at the same time also talking about Christianity. So can one exist with the other? So Neil, go for it.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, is if we're, if I can do an internal critique on the Christian lens, at looking at this from a Christian lens, Jesus does in fact come as a human, and when he comes here, he's the logos, he's reason, he brings, so these Pharisees and these Sadducees, and they're debating the law, and they're very like zealous of the law, right? Jesus comes and he's like, he comes along with reason, and he says, like, in Matthew 12, I have notes right here, I was putting these together. In Matthew 12, he talks about the Sabbath regulations, and if you have a sheep and it falls into a pit, aren't you just going to lift it out? Well, in fact, the law says you can't do that. We have Qumran laws, we have the Deuteronomy and Leviticus. You're not supposed to touch the animal on the Sabbath. But Jesus is reason. He's the logos. He says, no, get it out of the ditch. Why are you going to let the animal suffer? In Mark's gospel, he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? I mean, he's preaching mercy. And I think, for example, if we go to the idea of euthanasia, yes, from a Christian perspective, it is wrong to commit suicide, period. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to look at this in reason, through the lens of the logos reason, there's a person who's suffering, who is going to die no matter what. and their last month on this planet is just excruciating pain because they have a tumor that's squeezing their head together, and there's like they just want to go, they just want to live, they just want to or stop living. I think that's a perfect example of reason coming in and saying, yes, we know suicide's bad, but in this particular case, it's the mercy that we're acting on this person. And I think if some of these transhumanist, some of these humanist applications, whether it's living longer or whether it's, I don't know, some sort of stem cell thing, I think that same sort of reason can be applied in some of these areas where we can take a look and go, yeah, this is what we think, this is wrong, but in this particular case, this might be applicable here. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I really appreciate the nuanced perspective that you provided, Neil. To Lev's diagram, I think it does illustrate the distinction well, at least in a certain regard. I think there's also another dimension in terms of to what extent should these technologies be restricted in some manner. And I would say there shouldn't be any sort of automatic restriction, but there could be cultural norms and voluntary constraints that could arise. But in terms of getting to telos directly through philosophy or via Christianity, so of course I would say this, but as an atheist and materialist, even coming at this from just a very basic vantage point, how do I know that Jesus is the path and not, say, Allah or the God of the Old Testament or some strain of Buddhism or some strain of Hinduism or Zeus or Osiris or Thor?
You don't.
There's no way. And the Christians say, well, it's faith, but that faith is very culturally specific. The fact is, somebody who wasn't raised in a Christian culture, who wasn't familiar with Christianity, who didn't experience, say, Christian missionaries coming over, they wouldn't arrive at Jesus. They wouldn't arrive at the idea of Jesus. They would have some other local deity or some sort of cultural concept, whether that be a religion or a quasi-religious philosophy like Buddhism, which they would see as the way to the telos or something like the telos. And what I see from that are culturally specific contingent approaches that may have some insight and some validity in speaking to the human condition. So I don't mean this as an anti-Christian statement. In fact, I did bring up the Christian Transhumanist Association, and I think Grayson could have a very interesting debate with Micah Redding from the Christian Transhumanist Association. But I will say, I am not going to just assume that simply because the story of Jesus and his alleged resurrection is very firmly embedded in contemporary Western culture, that that is the story that I'm going to invest in. Instead, I will look at it as a story, as a myth, the way I would see the ancient Greek myths or the Egyptian myths or the Norse myths, and say, okay, Jesus was an interesting figure. I think he was probably a real historical figure who was killed unjustly at the age of around 33, so I've already outlived him. And he had some interesting insights that were novel for his time. What can be learned from those insights? But at the same time, how can insights like that or other insights achieved through reason or an understanding of the human condition be generalized, made universalizable, and extended into the future? Because let's face it, Jesus lived over 2,000 years ago now, and he may have had some, let's say, very forward-thinking views for his time, but he couldn't have anticipated the early 21st century. He couldn't have anticipated the technological progress
of course he could have. He's
right
God.
now. Well,
he's
you
still
think
alive,
he's God.
Gennady.
I am waiting for evidence. But look, if there were incontrovertible empirical evidence that Jesus did not die, that he is walking amongst us, and it's not some charlatan, I can see
He did die. That's the crazy part.
Very clearly. Well, if he were to appear and say, well, I'm the real Jesus, here's the proof, then okay, I would challenge him in some way. I would say, okay, can you make $1 million worth of gold appear in front of me? Real gold. I'm not going to lay any claim to it. I'm just going to ask you to do it because if you're God and you're omnipotent, can you do it? So this could be
bold of you to think that an
testable
omnipotent
hypothesis.
God would have patience for such
Well, if he's
trivialities.
omnibenevolent and omnipatient and omni-everything, maybe he might. But look, Thomas Jefferson had a great quotation about questioning boldly even the existence of a God, because if he does exist, he would appreciate being approached with reason rather than blindfolded fear. And I think whether or not God exists, and I'm quite a strong atheist, I do think that
Well, if you want to bring in Thomas Jefferson, I think if you want to bring in Thomas Jefferson, I think he's more on my side. There's the popular conception of him as a sort of proto-atheist, but he writes repeatedly about a belief in divine judgment that he worries is coming on the nation over slavery, which doesn't sound like a totally detached deist God. It sounds like one that has agency within the world. And more importantly, to my point, Thomas Jefferson believed in natural law. So even if he were a deist or even a closeted atheist, he believed in natural law. Or what?
He liked Jesus as a man, but he wrote his own. He made his own Bible version called the where he took out all the miracles and all the metaphysics, and it was just the sayings basically.
But my point, I mean, he believed in natural law. If he didn't, he couldn't have written the Declaration of Independence, which appeals to the laws of nature and nature's God. There's always been, but look at the pairing, right? Look at the pairing. The laws of nature and nature's God. Reason and revelation.
Sure.
If God is real, reason and revelation will not contradict one another. Revelation can build upon reason.
Yeah.
But it would be absurd for God to create a world in a particular way and create humanity in a particular way. Yeah. And then give us commands about how we ought to live that are completely extrinsic to our nature. But it would be absurd to create us as bipedal beings and then say hop on one foot, for example. And he doesn't do that. That's why it's natural law. That's why it's discoverable by reason. Apart from revelation. It wasn't the case that on Mount Sinai it was the first time anyone ever heard "Thou shalt not kill." That's a point that's discoverable by reason. That's why Confucius, Lao Tzu, Aristotle, King Solomon, Jesus all share so many of the same insights. Because these things are discoverable by unaided reason.
But that's why I wanted to do an internal critique for you, because you brought up Jesus coming in as a human, and obviously me and Gennady don't think that happened. I agree with him. I think there was a guy named Jesus. I think the Gospels have a purpose of writing a sort of mythology, drawing from Old Testament motifs and so cultural motifs. Anyways, long story short is you brought up reason, and if there's a God exists, then he definitely, he's a just God, right? But under that same world, under that same point, why would the universe allow us to even come up with these things in science that can bring us to extend our lives or to improve us or to change genders and do all this insane shit, when if we had a just God, a creator God, could have created the world so that those things are impossible, but they're possible. So it kind of leads to the idea of like Peter having a dream where, oh wait, God gave us all this food. Why are we limiting shellfish and pork? We should be able to eat shellfish because God gave it this way. I think that sort of principle.
Yeah, well, this is something that's not wrong. That's not wrong according to nature. The idea that you shouldn't eat shellfish is not kind of intuitive to reason. That's an addition of revelation that can then be modified through further revelation. It's not a contradiction of the natural law.
A bad example, but what I'm saying is the world let's go with this. The world was created by God, an all-knowing, all-perfect, wise, just God. Well, under this world that we're in, we see things happening naturally, occurring naturally, but we can also use things in nature.
Okay, I see. So your question is like, why can we do that? I mean, that's kind of just sort of fundamental to free will, I think. The one tree is placed in the garden. It's like the one thing wrong that you can do, and they do it. I would love to go full steam ahead on technology. I'm not like a a huge degrowth or anything. I'm like, let's go colonize space. My analogy for the use of technology is, it comes from G.K. Chesterton. It's sort of a little parable he tells in one of his books, and I can't even remember the original. Well, okay, now I remember. But anyway, he says, like, imagine there's a small sort of island like that juts up out of the ocean, and there's a sort of circle of grass on top of it. Maybe 30 feet wide, 30 feet in diameter, and it's a 100-foot sheer drop onto sharp rocks on every side. And imagine there's a wall around it or a fence around it, and you put a bunch of children in there. As long as the fence is up, they can roughhouse and run and play and tackle each other and play Marco Polo with their eyes closed and do whatever else. You take the fence away and you come back and you find the children all huddling in the middle of the island, terrified. So I got to talk to Peter Thiel a while ago for a few minutes, and it was really fascinating. But he has this whole thing that he talks about this in like the Doubted interview he did, where it was like "Are you the Antichrist?" thing, but where he thinks that Thiel basically thinks that there's a fear that like technology is the Antichrist, that it's going to like bring about some destruction of humanity through nuclear war or transhumanism or whatever else. But Thiel wants to take the opposite view and say, well, no, it's the fear of technology that's going to ultimately be the Antichrist, because that fear will lead people to empower sort of a totalitarian state that can restrain technological progress. So he, and I mean, this is somewhat, self-interested, I think, because he himself is a technologist and wants his technology to be
you could
adopted
still
and
see
move
that.
forward. It's good for his bottom line. But I see I see his point. Yeah,
He is a Christian.
And what I said to Thiel in response is like, I think people would be less afraid of technology if you put that fence up, if you erected those guardrails, if you said, we are going to take humanity as our constant in this equation, and we are going to shape technologies around the human person to help him flourish as a human, as the kind of being that he is, and not to reshape him into something else and invent some new telos for him, or invent some new nature for him, or make him into something new. We're going to terraform the planets. We're not going to genetically engineer the people to live on the planets. That's the future I want for technology, and I think that gives us plenty to do. I think
there's a little bit of a disagreement
a great
here.
arena in which great minds can operate.
There's a little bit of a disagreement here that, let's say, between you and Gennady, I could possibly see there being something in the middle where it's not necessarily the kind of telos you're talking about, Grayson, but neither is Gennady's telos. So if we're talking about technology comes from the Greek word techne, and it's not just like the instrumental idea of technology. It's like an art of disclosure that's able to uncover various possibilities that are hidden not just in nature, but also hidden within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is that we're not just talking about abiding by whatever cargo cult we happen to consider human nature and nature itself as being, but we're talking about going all the way, from just improving medicine and shipbuilding and rhetoric and the printing press and electricity and nuclear physics and biotech and artificial intelligence, to then talking about other, let's say, more quote-unquote otherworldly things that Gennady doesn't believe exist right now, but that's fine, like Kundalini awakening, pranayama, astral projection, remote viewing, ESP, like all these things. And look, I do have the receipts for Gennady. If they're needed, if they're well, we're going to get to demons later. But if you're looking, Gennady, for the receipts, because I'm not going to be able to probably have a chance to talk about this later on, so I'm just quickly going to go through this. Remote viewing, Ingo Swann, it described towers, domes, and artificial-looking structures on Mars. Joe McGonigal, this is 1984. He also reported these various megalithic cities on Mars. And these impressions aligned with the various CIA declassified reports. Animal's Eye, Henrik's cat, this was the early 20th century, escaped in an unfamiliar city, yet this cat returned home the same night. Bastian Schmidt's dogs, released in a strange terrain, oriented almost instantly towards home and navigated obstacles with precision. And Rupert Sheldrake did various experiments with dogs, where he worked with households where the dogs had really strong bonds with their owners, much like Neil has his dog. And the owners would leave the house without fixed routines or cues, sometimes varying departure times and means of travel. And to rule out conditioning, Sheldrake randomized return times and sometimes had the owners come back in taxis and familiar cars, whatever, on foot. And observers at home monitor the dog's behavior, often using video cameras. And their findings was that the dogs typically began to wait at the window or door precisely at the moment when their owners, miles away, decided to return home. And this correlation was independent of the time of day, the sound of familiar cars, patterns and schedule. So the implication here is that the anticipation wasn't explained by ordinary sensory cues or habit. Instead, Sheldrake interpreted it as evidence of a non-local connection or telepathic bond between human and dog. And my last example here, and I could be here all day with this stuff, Nkisi the parrot. So this is an African gray parrot who knew more than 700 words. And in these controlled studies by Rupert Sheldrake, it produced relevant words corresponding to its owner's unseen experiences, interpreted as cross-species telepathy. So what that means is that the owner viewed images in a separate room from the parrot while the parrot's speech was recorded. And the results showed that the parrot correctly described images, quote, against overwhelming statistical odds. So like somebody was sleeping, or there's a car. So that's another example here with the parrot. There's other examples of plant psi abilities and so on and so forth. So the reason why I'm saying all this is that there are other things beyond what we currently know, per that little phone illustration that I showed you, where you get from looking in, from being a lover of Sophia, from being a philosopher, towards your telos, while, let's say, with yourself, Grace, and other Christians, you have to go through Jesus Christ in order to get to that same telos. There is no way for you to be able to just apply this techne, just apply.
Well, I think there's such a thing as righteous pagans, right? St. Paul says that when Gentiles follow the natural law without knowledge of it, they are a law unto themselves. So I think that it's certainly possible to do your best to live in accordance with nature and strive toward that, toward eudaimonia, apart from God. I just think that if the human telos is ultimately not just sort of some idea of the good life here on earth, or of even Gennady's technologically facilitated immortality, but is in fact reigning with Christ for eternity, then yes, like if that's what the ultimate human telos is, then yes, it requires divine.
But isn't the question of eudaimonia or eudaimonia, however you want to pronounce it, isn't that something that is separate than this question of applying transhumanist stuff in medicine? Like, isn't that something you do as an individual? You find your path to being a good person. You can do that regardless of this stuff going on, right?
Well, I don't think it is a question of finding your path per se. Aristotle lays out,
I'm saying finding good
lays out the virtues, right? Yeah.
I mean,
we know what not every good life looks the same. Of course, we're not purpose-built robots that need to all live identical lives in order to be virtuous or to achieve human flourishing. But that said, there is a way, a path, a Tao, that
I agree.
The human as human should follow to flourish as human. And to step off that path is to court self-destruction, I think.
So what I will say is, even within that framework, you do not have a way of knowing that your telos, or God's will as applied to it, isn't for you to live 200 years so that you could do good works, or however long you could live potentially so as to fulfill your role in God's plan or whatever cosmic order you either believe to exist or consider to be justified. But I've had this discussion with Christians before. around 2018, there was an older Christian gentleman who attended RADFest. RAD stands for Revolution Against Aging and Death. And he and I had a conversation, and he was interested in these emerging technologies, but he said, well, I'm a Catholic. I believe I eventually want to join Jesus in heaven. And I said, however, if you were able through technology to live for 200 years and do good works, would you be favorably inclined toward that? Would you want to see that happen? And he said, yes, I'd like to stay alive for much longer and do good works, and then I'll join Jesus in heaven. And I told him, well, in the proximate future, this means you and I are aligned, because we still need to figure out a way to get human lifespans lengthened to 200. And after you're 200, we'll have another conversation and see what your inclinations are. At that point, maybe you won't want to join Jesus in heaven just yet. Maybe you'll want to stay around for a little longer and do good works. And again, it seems a bit, let's say, limiting.
Perhaps we'll get there. I mean, the early chapters of Genesis, people live,
Right.
routinely into the
Right.
7, 8, and 900s.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm not necessarily, as I said earlier, I'm not necessarily opposed to life extension through the kind of continuous repair of the human body as it breaks down and ages. I'm immensely glad, for example, that my father is able to have a knee replacement and not be crippled in his old age. To me, that's not a transhumanist technology, really. It's a knee replacement is an artificial knee is replicating the form and function of the body part it's replacing, the same way a prosthetic hand does, or an artificial pacemaker. If you were to replace your severed hand with a laser gun, I would say that's, something extrinsic to what a healthy human body is. And there you've crossed into transhumanism. But if you just, if I lost my hand and you gave me a prosthetic hand that mimicked my actual hand,
what is
I think that's
what are you using to determine when it crosses over that line where it's no longer good? And it's
well,
now...
I mean, I think just whether it's attempting to restore me to what a healthy functioning human body is, or whether it's attempting to augment or alter me in some way extrinsic to what we know to be, a healthy human state.
But I think that's mostly a definitional distinction that you're trying to make.
I don't think it is. I have a hand. I don't have a laser gun. Right. I think we know what a straight line and a crooked line look like. We know that Down syndrome is a disorder because we know what a healthy human genome looks like. Sure. And by the way, I'd be totally fine if there were a gene therapy that could correct that in utero.
Great.
Catholic bioethics would say, I think there's an alternate. I think there's an opposite extreme of my position that's I don't know what you'd call it, kind of like a radical constructivist view or something that would just say, transhumanism kind of throws out the standard and the idea of nature from one direction. I think the other way you could throw it out is just to say, like, all disabilities are socially constructed, everyone's the same. Having an idea of normal or normality is oppressive inherently in some way. This is kind of like a left-wing view that you often encounter. I would say, no, that's not the case. Like, if there's, if we know what a healthy, flourishing human being looks like, and something's wrong with you, it's fine to fix that. If you're deaf,
but it's not just talking about
if your baby has Downs, it's fine to fix that.
Like Japan
my concern
just did,
comes when you get into fixing what's not broken. And once again, I'm concerned that we don't know how to draw that line, because so many things are defined as pathologies that are not. ADHD, for example, is not caused by a genetic or abnormality or any endocrinal issue that we know of.
Right.
It's just hyperactivity is normally distributed. It's a bell curve. And
I agree.
If you're far to one end, they give you drugs to correct that. If gene therapies are available, who's to say that rather than, giving the kid Ritalin when they can't sit still in school, they won't just, if you're in the 95th percentile or higher for hyperactivity, we'll just kind of snip that off. We'll just, bump you over a little bit.
But we're not just
I
talking
wouldn't
about...
support that, by the way. I wouldn't support that, by the way. I don't think ADHD is a disease the way Down syndrome is.
I'm glad you wouldn't support it, but we're coming back to the same dynamic we keep hitting, which is I don't actually think that your lack of support for that is going to prevent it from happening once you let that technology off the leash.
But here's the thing, and to my broader point, what transhumanists in their majority advocate for is the prompter arrival of technologies that are mostly going to do the benign things that you yourself acknowledged as being benign, like cure Down syndrome. There have been some advances in that regard recently in Japan, or lengthen lifespans, or fix clearly broken parts of the human body, or prosthetics, artificial limbs, restoring eyesight, restoring hearing to people. In the next 20 to 30 years, that is going to be, let's say, 99.5% of what transhumanists focus on. And sure, there will be some individuals who might think, well, I want to have gills, or I want to have scales, or whatnot, but they're not going to be, not just in the majority, they're not going to be a sizable minority. There might be 12 of them who host online meetups sometime, and maybe every 5 years go to a convention where they meet up in person. I don't think using them to say this is transhumanism is really characterizing transhumanism fairly with regard to what we're really trying to overcome, which are the problems that plague pretty much all of us. We're all aging and dying unless we do something about it. And we all face these more routine disease conditions. Some of us succumb to different diseases than others, but we're all going to have major struggles with disease and disability within the next few decades unless we do something about it. And to say, oh, transhumanism is bad because some people might use this technology in weird ways, that could cripple the progress in the ways that you would consider benign, because it would create a fear of transhumanism. I mean, you are definitely more, let's say, reasonable in how you characterize it than someone like Alex Jones, but someone like Alex Jones would seize on what you're saying and would say, well, look, these Satanist, reptilian, New World Order types, they're just going to use this to dominate all of humanity and put you in a prison planet. And we need to rise up and we need to stop these nefarious technologies before it's too late. He's already saying that. But
sure, of course. I think there's, I don't know if there's a name for this, you know, the fallacy of good intentions, perhaps.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
I'm not convinced, just because the track record so far is so bad.
How is it?
We're in beta with many, you know, we're in beta with these technologies, right? Like we don't have kind of full spectrum, you know, gene therapies for humans where we can tweak the genome of a fetus in sort of an infinite number of ways that we choose, right? We're very early stages with that technology in terms of the tweaks we can make in utero. But what we do have is, I think the company is called Orchid, the IVF genetic screening company, where you can kind of have this like cheeky little workaround where if you can't conceive one child and fix it in the womb, you can conceive 12 and kill the 11 that are less optimal and pick the one you like. You know, in which case you really do have this Procrustean bed society where you are, you know, cutting off the people who don't fit the norms, many of which are socially constructed. You know, ADHD boys didn't have a problem before the advent of modern schooling, for example, when they were running around on farms, and in which you have already completely severed sex from reproduction and have completely altered the relationship between parent and child, from one of parent and child to one of consumer and product.
I could give a quick example, by the way, and this was in his own words. Nick Fuentes is an IVF baby, and he himself complains about this and says, like, thanks, Mom, not having me in the natural way here.
Yeah, well, IVF babies are perfectly human. I wouldn't denigrate anyone's humanity because they were born in a non-ideal
but if there are
way.
Certain,
the same way I wouldn't do that if they were born
that he's
of unwed
experiencing
parents or something.
But if there are certain problems, I'm not saying that this is for all the IVF babies, but can we see certain psychological issues maybe happening with certain people who are born in particular ways or not? If not, then that's fine. Then Nick Fuentes is just an outlier. I
think it would be more likely to come about with surrogacy rather than with IVF, because in IVF, typically it's still the mother carrying the child. But with surrogacy, I have seen, anecdotal evidence of mothers struggling to bond to their surrogate born children. And of the surrogates experiencing higher than normal rates of preeclampsia and gestational diabetes and things like that. Where this is another sort of early down payment we've gotten on transhumanism, where once again the results are bad. You have poor women being used as broodmares for the wealthy. The wealthy women get to harvest the fruits of transhumanism at the expense of all these other people. And I'm sure you'll say like, oh, well, we want the technology to get better so that it doesn't have to come at the expense of anyone. But look at what your ideology is doing right now.
So I have to disagree here. First of all, Nick Fuentes' problem isn't that he was an IVF baby. Nick Fuentes' problem is that he's Nick Fuentes. And again,
okay, well, we agree on something.
Like that shooter in Minnesota, we cannot use a singular instance of a person who didn't turn out well, and I agree he didn't turn out well, to essentially tarnish an entire group, because his having belonged to that group doesn't necessitate that process of being part of that group as having brought about his malfeasance.
And I'm glad Nick Fuentes is born. I wouldn't have wanted his mom to throw that embryo away.
Right. But in terms of, say, embryo selection, so your criticism is 12 embryos are created, only one is implanted. But so many embryos are created that aren't implanted, both through so-called natural processes, because not every conception results in implantation, as well as
sure. I mean, children die in house fires. Should I take a flamethrower to one?
No, but
what about the millions of sperm? Only
sperm
one
or gametes. Let's not do that. Come on, that's sperm or gametes.
Fair enough.
I'm not going to go in that direction, but I will go in the direction of stem cell research. Embryonic stem cell research was, in my view, unjustly banned by the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s because they equated essentially working on embryos to murdering the unborn. But the fact is, the vast majority of those embryos, they were already outside the womb. They wouldn't be implanted in anybody.
Okay.
If they were lucky, they would just stay frozen indefinitely, but most of them would just get thrown away. So human
value is determined by, from what I'm hearing, location, prospects, and longevity. So by all of this logic, if a person is standing in the right location, has few prospects in life, and will not live very long, I can shoot them.
No, because that is a fully formed human being. And an
embryo is also a fully formed human being. It is a member of the human species with a unique genetic code.
Not an embryo that's not implanted and not going to be developing into anything. So I don't want to have
It is still a human. Yeah. It is still a member of the human species.
I don't want to have an abortion type debate, because with abortion, there is a process that is ongoing that would be terminated. So
yes, we want to talk about
telos. I would be more sympathetic to your position. I don't like abortion. I don't think it's practical to restrict it by law because of all of the underground activities that would be happening. But I want to end the kind of abortion that destroys a living being through artificial wombs, through evicting that fetus or implanted embryo, whatever the case may be. But I've always found the opposition to embryonic stem cell research on non-implanted embryos that were never going to be implanted to just be illogical and, let's say, dogmatic to the point of destroying real life-saving potential for people who have already been born or are alive, or maybe even pregnant mothers who might benefit from certain treatments like that in the future. But
Well,
the fact
I don't think it's illogical
if,
at all. I think it's rigorously logical. I think your position is the emotivist one, actually. Here,
Wait,
like, I think
just so
you're-
we're clear about
yeah.
what we're talking about, just so we're clear, what Gennady's talking about, would the process of women having abortions result in more of those being available, or no? Because if we're talking about like what leads to more kind of, are there certain things that would be more, let's say, encouraged to happen were there to be more of those available, even if they're not going to be used for anything else? Would that
Well,
be
I
correct
think this
or not?
goes to a question of anthropology, though, because you talk about like wanting to, end the process, the practice of abortion through artificial wombs, which suggests that you have what's sort of the strongest, or foundational pro-abortion argument, because I found in my arguments with people about abortion is they pretty quickly retreat from any version of the "it's not a baby" argument, because it just obviously is a member of the human species with a unique genetic code. And I think objections to that are just based on magical thinking that want to assign value at some arbitrary point that makes no sense and isn't rooted in science the way that my position is, which assigns value to human life at the moment it becomes human life, which is conception. So the fallback position is the bodily autonomy argument, or the morphological freedom argument, you would say, I suppose, which I think gets the human person wrong. I think gets anthropology wrong. I think rejects the idea of, the human as an embodied being. Because our bodies are just the product of accidents of evolution, which this is a slightly side note. I'm not making a pure creationist argument or anything. I think that the process of evolution is perfectly compatible with the natural law framework I'm doing. If you believe in some kind of theistic evolution, or even some kind of non-theistic life force, or elan vital, like non-Christian thinkers like Henri Bergson and George Bernard Shaw believed in, that evolution had a telos to produce humans as the kind of beings we are, or perhaps something beyond us, but like at least to produce us as we are today. Anyway, it posits this idea of the human, that this view of abortion as a disembodied will, fundamentally, where you have the right to, at any point in pregnancy, designate your unborn child as an invader and then withhold the sustenance and shelter of your body from it. Which I think, many people are very dogmatic about, but I think strikes a lot of people as kind of fundamentally absurd in some way. That you would, treat your, a tiny little fetus like it's a home invader, like it's an axe murderer running around in your house, and you just want to, shoot him and get him out, right? So I think that if you take my view, if you take a view of human nature that accounts for human embodiment and doesn't reject it in favor of this kind of radical, disembodied Sartrean view of freedom, then you're free to say that, yes, we can derive duties from the kind of beings we are. We can derive oughts from our is. And you can say that a mother has a duty to shelter and nourish her unborn child, just as a mother has duties to her children after they're born, which we recognize in law. If you don't feed your toddler, you can go to jail. So I don't know why we don't recognize an even greater duty when the child's degree of dependence is much greater and the mother is the only one who can provide it.
Well, I think there are many situations that the people who would call themselves pro-choice proponents would put forth as to why someone might conceivably want to make that decision. And again, I don't exactly want to make their arguments here. It's simply that I want to counter your claim by saying, yes, they can provide a number of situations, either from the standpoint of it would be financially crippling or destructive of their aspirations for personal self-actualization, or maybe they experienced some sort of rape or other kind of violation that would lead them to see this as an invasion, a violation of their sovereignty. There could be a number of life circumstances that could happen that
I think the mother's,
frankly couldn't happen to me.
I think the mother's subjective. I think the mother's subjective
make
feelings
sure
though
we
here
don't
are somewhat
I want to make sure we don't go down the
objectively,
whole
does
of
a duty
the
exist or not?
we can't go down the whole of the abortion debate.
Right.
That would be too much, but I want to go back to what Gennady said, because here's the thing. I'm a simple man when it comes to certain concepts I don't understand really well at first, but now I think I understand this a little bit better. So with the IVF process, when there's the case that IVF is happening and the doctor transfers a select number of the healthiest embryos into the woman's uterus, there are going to be leftover embryos. This has nothing to do with abortion, right? If you guys are on the same page about this, right? So
Right.
I think what Gennady was talking about was, okay, so we got these leftover embryos. Why not be able to use them for the stem cells? It's a win-win. Like, what else
Yes.
you're going to be doing in that situation? So that would be the
Exactly.
question for Grayson.
Exactly.
Well, I would
There's-
say they shouldn't be created in the first place. I think IVF is wrong.
So you think all IVF is wrong. So
Yes.
This is where I think your views shift from what I would call status quo bias to a kind of reactionary aspect. Because look, IVF has been in existence for 46 years now, ever since Louise Brown was born. And the people who have been created using IVF are genetically identical. They look, they act.
Yes, and for
they
every one of them,
interface
we've killed 10
the
others.
same way. Well, killed, what does that mean? Would they have ever been born? Would they have ever been fully fledged autonomous human beings with consciousness?
I think
with
human life
rational
has
faculty?
value regardless of how long it lasts. I think that human beings should not be killed just because they don't have really great prospects. I don't think we should just
okay, and I don't want to focus on this that much, but just to take what Grayson was talking about, if it goes back to the decision that the potential mother made of whether to have these different embryos being, selected, that is the decision of the mother. So regardless of whether or not we consider that to be the right decision, it does go to the mother to make that decision.
Well, historically, there's been no embryo screening, right? You would just create, half a dozen embryos and try to implant them and see what happened. Because
sometimes you would get like a baby.
The embryo screening technology, where you can go through and sort of just condemn your offspring to death by swiping left, is a very new.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other dimension to this, which I don't want to get into in full right now, but I do want to leave one thing that Gennady's not going to agree with. Grayson, I have no idea if you are going to agree with it or not, but since I was talking about more of this quote-unquote mystical stuff, there are many studies that are done by this Dr. Ian Stevenson, where he documented cases of what he and his colleagues consider to be reincarnation, when they were speaking with kids about what they consider to be their past lives and having like little marks on their bodies, like little scars, little birthmarks that correlate to the areas that they say that they were cut, that they were stabbed, or that they were shot. And they talked about the process of selecting the new mom and dad and going into that embryo to later on become that life. So all I mean to say there is that if that is in any way true, and I'm not saying that it is, but if that is true, then that does open up the question of how exactly it works as far as the ghost in the machine, the soul, the consciousness that ends up embodying a certain thing, and at what point that embodiment starts to get a lot more solidified. So that way we're not just talking about human life as is from the beginning with the DNA strands and all of that being the be-all, end-all. We're talking about the combination of that plus the reincarnation of the past individual into this new form. And I'm not going to get into it that much right now. I just want to throw that out there, something that probably neither Grayson nor Gennady, I don't know about Neil here, but neither of you guys would agree with, but I just wanted to put that out there. But I want to go back to the main subject that I was talking about with Neil and Grayson, because I would be amiss if we did not discuss this as much as we should, which is self-willed disclosure versus God-given disclosure. And it does kind of relate to what I just said with reincarnation, because if we're talking about self-will disclosure, that to me is another aspect of transhumanism, the ability to not just like correct certain problems in our health, or not like take puberty blockers in order to stop a process that otherwise would have been possibly way more rewarding to us if we weren't stuck in a particular woke hive mind, so to speak, right? I'm not talking about either of those. I'm talking about self-will disclosure as far as being able to discover things that may be outside the purview of what we consider to be reality. And this is where I want to go to Neil here, as far as what a lot of these ancient philosophers talked about, what the process of loving Sophia, loving wisdom is in order to be able to get to that higher level of understanding. They did not need to go through revelations of the Bible. Some of them may have, but not all of them. So when it comes to separating, again, bringing up that picture on the phone that I showed you, why do we need something like Christianity in order to attain true gnosis? And Neil, I don't think you consider us needing Christianity in order to achieve that. So what say you?
Wouldn't you be asking Grayson that?
No, because I want to know first your perspective as somebody who does not need Christianity in order to achieve true gnosis, what your process is, and whether you feel like it is possible for human beings to self-will disclosure without needing some kind of a revelatory process, without needing a burning bush.
I don't know. I think there's a middle ground here. I think we have knowledge bases that are built upon other knowledge bases, and we pass those down, and then there's new PhDs come out and they write their dissertation and they kind of change what we know about things, and we're sort of building off of that over time, and we learn more things, and we that's knowledge and on one end, and then there's wisdom on another end. Wisdom is the lessons learned in life, and debates and theology and all that stuff. And I don't know. I think over time people have different schools of thought, and I don't know if there's really. I'm not going to be able to come at you with some objective determination on this topic here. That's why this debate is happening right now. So
absolutely, no, fair enough. But there are two things that I wanted to make sure we do get to, which is related to this process of uncovering. So, Grayson, you brought up the figure of Lucifer, and you brought up Lucifer as this negative serpent, tempter, whatever. But from what I understand, Neil, like Lucifer within the Torah,
I feel negatively about Lucifer, sure.
Well, Lucifer does not imply that. Lucifer was a term that was used like as an analogy for like some Babylonian king. Right, Neil? Like, what exactly was that?
In Isaiah, so what happened was Lucifer.
Yeah, that Isaiah passage is tricky because he like kind of flips between talking about a king and talking about a fallen angel, and it's sort of.
I don't think he ever was talking about a fallen angel. I think that so later.
You don't? Well,
so here's what I think happened here.
I do.
Lucifer is a title, and there is a god called Lucifer. He's in Ovid's Metamorphosis. He's the light bringer, but it's also an epithet that's applied to Apollo and Artemis, and it's the light bringer. That's it. It's very simple. There's nothing else there. Nothing, no Satan. There's no devil or demon or anything. And then what happened is Christianity is looking at the Old Testament through the Septuagint, and there's this passage about the king of Babylon being like Hillel ben Shakar, which is it's the planet. It's basically the planet Venus, which is equated with Lucifer. Yeah. So in the Latin Bible, they use the term Lucifer there, and it's like, here, you have fallen like Lucifer. So then Christian theologians are basically determining that Lucifer is another epithet for Satan because Satan is the fallen angel. So Lucifer and Satan become synonymous in Christianity after that. That's kind of what happened there. Now, are you asking me, is that what you're asking me? What Satan or Lucifer is? There you go.
Yes, because if we're talking about Lucifer as being this symbol of acquiring all of this power and using it wrongly, in a way, I'm not really seeing, like, Grayson, you still think that Lucifer has to do with Satan, despite this, I guess I should say, evidence of
Well,
where it came from and how it became what it is.
Well, I
would
take the kind of majority historical traditional Christian interpretation of that passage in Isaiah, but I'm not gonna, I don't feel the need to go to the mat about terms here, Lucifer, Satan, the devil. I'm just kind of, you can split hairs on all of these, and you can have productive discussions about that. I've heard very interesting ones, but I'm just kind of using it in the common parlance right now.
So here's the thing. Yeah. Here's the thing. If Lucifer is the bringer of light, literally, what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is bringing light. And who else in mythology brought light? Prometheus, the figure of Prometheus. There we go. So do I think Prometheus was a good figure? Yes, absolutely. I think Prometheus was a good figure. Do I think enlightenment is good? Well, I host weekly virtual enlightenment salons, so I think that should illustrate my perspective or illuminate my perspective. So if Lucifer is the bringer of light, I do not see that as a deleterious figure. Again, I'm not a Christian, so I don't believe in Satan, just as I don't believe in God. But it seems that the negative characterization of Lucifer is a form of, let's say, pre-modern Christian propaganda, where there was a period of time, especially during the, let's say, early Middle Ages through, let's say, the 1600s or so, when various Christian denominations were actively hostile toward the systematic application of reason for illuminating the world and the human condition, because they saw faith and reason as opposed. And gradually Christianity evolved away from that, especially during the Age of Enlightenment. So again, I'm not going to opine on whether Lucifer is Satan. I wouldn't call myself a Satanist because I'm not in that paradigm. But I don't think Lucifer characterized as Lucifer is necessarily a bad figure. And when Grayson characterizes transhumanism as Luciferian, my view of that is okay. And so why is that bad?
Yeah.
Why is
and
that
bad?
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. Like,
things. Hold on, there are two different things though. And Gennady, I think this kind of helps your point. Like that term Lucifer coming from Isaiah is comparing him to a good thing that fell. And then so Lucifer becoming synonymous with Satan is just like, it's just like it doesn't even, like, even Jesus is called Morning Star in Revelation. It's a title. So Satan being called Lucifer is because he fell.
This is a traditional view that he has an exalted position from which he falls. But to your point, Gennady, like there's a lot of people who don't believe in Satan as a literal spiritual being, but believe in him as a symbol of human liberation and human striving. This is the whole kind of shtick of the Satanic Temple. That's their view. They claim not to believe in a literal devil, but they. And I write about them in my book a little bit because many of their tenets are very have a lot of points of commonality with transhumanist values.
Yes, and I would say the Satanic Temple as an organization is fairly benign based on what I understand of their values. They're not the caricature of Satanists that, let's say, fundamentalist Christian propaganda.
Sure, so I'm just saying. If you look at it from my perspective, the fact that their tenets seem benign by modern standards, from my perspective, only goes to show how effectively the evil one is at work in our society and in shaping the values and the philosophy that people imbibed through the air and water, so to speak.
But if we look at the Satanic Temple for a second, they could be, let's say, naive in the libertarian mixed with SJW, like early 2000s mindset, if you will.
I don't think Satan cares if you believe in him.
No, fair enough. Well, before we
he doesn't want worship per se. He just wants to destroy you, and he can do that without you believing literally in him.
But if we are talking about people like these quote unquote Satanists and the view that they have, I could compare that to something like Lucifer in the way that Neil was using it as a light bringer, and this would Gennady kind of shone the light on me for a second, and I woke up to why it was that I was so frustrated by this Lucifer discussion right now. It's because it seems to me that Christianity, by framing Lucifer, the light bearer, as this negative force, acted as a gatekeeper, as a gatekeeping device against anybody who decides, like a Gemistus Plethon, for instance, in the Byzantine Empire, who rather than saying Christ and God said Zeus, but still used Zeus in the same teleological sense as being the Godhead. So that didn't go away.
I don't know much about him, but I think
no.
I think
Just a quick example, though.
I think the faith and reason
yeah.
thing is inaccurate, though. I think that, look at a figure like Thomas Aquinas. He's one of the great philosophers of all time. Like, is one of the, just objectively one of the great commentators on Aristotle of all time. Like, this is someone who rigorously used reason alongside faith. And even when you get into the early modern period, when you're seeing the birth of science, Isaac Newton's a devoutly religious man. Copernicus is a cleric, I believe. Everyone wants to say Galileo. That was politics, man. It was all wrapped up in politics, and it's unfortunate that it happened, but it was by no means the paradigm. Gregor Mendel was a priest. The discoverer of the Big Bang was a Jesuit priest.
But you may be confusing because of with in spite of. If we're talking about how much power the church wielded during those times, I would be very surprised if some of those brilliant minds even had any choice. Like, they had to think in a certain way. That was their worldview. That's how they were able to navigate it. And I
think the idea that the church is suppressing scientific knowledge, though, just simply isn't accurate. Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model and was not punished by the church, did not have his ideas suppressed by the church.
He had to wait
Galileo
until
did because he was
died.
kind of a dick to the Pope. That's people have egos. That doesn't mean that the church was systematically suppressing knowledge.
Wait. I want to get
wasn't
Neil.
the only one. So Copernicus had to wait until he died to publish his theory because he didn't want it to be known in his lifetime or associated with him. The Inquisition was already running rampant at the time. And then there's the very tragic and completely unjustified case of Giordano Bruno, who was literally burned at the stake for proposing that there were other worlds like Earth. So this is, I think, just one illustration of thousands of situations where the Catholic Inquisition led to the destruction of thinkers, the destruction of books, the destruction of those who didn't adhere to the official dogma. And one could quibble about Galileo. Yes, he might have stepped on some toes. It was still completely unjustified what happened to him, but he wasn't the only one. He's just the most famous example of this. But the fact is, the Enlightenment had to put an end to a lot of travesties, to witch burnings, to inquisitions, to book burnings, to imprisonment of people for blasphemy or atheism. And this was a huge accomplishment. This was the transformational point in Western history where Christianity largely stopped being a dogmatic, anti-progressive institution and became much more benign. And I do think Christianity is much more benign today than it used to be. I don't characterize all Christian sects in the same way, but compared to what it was in the 17th century, most Christian sects are much more aligned with Enlightenment values and the values that I aspire toward. So I would say one of my critiques of any sort of religious opposition to transhumanism is the simple observation that religions evolve. And religions evolve not because of some sort of access to transcendent truth, but because they adapt to changes in the external society. Generally, I would characterize mainstream religion as a kind of lagging indicator of where the societal attitudes tended to be about 30 to 40 years ago. And it tends to come along as societal attitudes change, for better or for worse, by the way. But there will certainly be adaptations of Christianity and other mainstream religions to transhumanism. Even though I'm an atheist, I don't think religions
Well, I think
will
there
go
will
away.
be too. I just think that's a bad thing. I think that's literally the religion of the Antichrist, in fact.
But as far as
So
the suppressions that Gennady was talking about right now, like with Bruno and so on and so forth, we could see that as being kind of a gatekeeping device. Now, you could say, well, it was for the greater good, but this is the gradient, right? Where on one hand, you have kids that are taking the hormone blockers and a lot of potentially bad stuff down the road. On
Yeah,
the other
exactly.
hand,
Thank God we've freed ourselves from superstition and
no, but this
anti-science
is
stuff. So now we can believe that men are women.
but this is the big problem. Like, we're seeing this from a very black and white way. I'm trying to show the gradient here, where on one hand we have that, but on the other hand we have the good old faith with everybody subscribing to whatever it is the priest is saying, even if they're talking Latin, they don't even understand what he's saying. Like, then there's this other kind of village life, which you could see. To be fair, the Catholics, they had the hospitals, charities, a lot of great stuff when it comes to that. But at the same time, there was a lot of gatekeeping. You couldn't get to the telos. You couldn't be a virtuous pagan at a certain point. You know what I mean? They'd crucify you if you were a virtuous pagan at a certain point. So that's why, if we have this kind of thing, we could say, well, maybe that is for the greater good. Maybe it's for the greater good that, because we're so afraid of people harnessing this inner fire to do bad things, and we see a lot of evidence of people using it for bad things, then we have to put people into this state of maybe, like, I don't know, like, pick a century and say, okay, this is fine. We're not going to go beyond this. And my concern here is that when we're talking about the actual solutions, I'm not going to make a straw man argument against what you were saying, Grayson, since I understand you have no problem with life extension, you have no problem with treating various kinds of diseases. My only contention is that, unfortunately, whenever we get to the stage of figuring that stuff out, we're also going to have a lot of bad stuff that comes our way. And who is the power that gets to control the good stuff from the bad stuff? You know what I mean? Like, that tends to be the attitude that a lot of, I would say, even like National Socialists have, where they understand that we're living in this futuristic landscape of instantaneous information. I guess for them it was the radio back then. And they understood that, okay, we have to create this super orderly society, and yes, we're going to have to destroy a lot of people in order to achieve that, but we're not living in the Middle Ages anymore, and we have to adapt to the tech. So that's my question to you, Grayson. If we're talking about organized religion adopting itself to the tech, how would it do it for the greater good?
So, I mean, I think that the way we could safely use technology in a way that I wouldn't find threatening, I suppose, to my religious principles, I guess, but that I think are also rooted in reason and natural law, is just to return to that understanding of natural law. I'm black-pilled, though. Like, I don't think we're going to do that. I do think that any attempt to abruptly return to a society rooted in a robust understanding of natural law, which our nation was founded on, the founders all believed in natural law, the laws of nature and of nature's God. George Washington saying there's a link, sort of this grand cosmic link between virtue and happiness or flourishing, all these things, right? These guys believed in natural law. But any attempt to return to some kind of society rooted in a robust understanding of natural law would be experienced as authoritarian by the vast majority of people. And I'm not confident that there's any constituency to, carry out such a regime change or revolution that would bring about some kind of natural law republic that would be able to place guardrails that would channel technological innovation toward promoting authentic human goods and not toward turning around and deconstructing and reconstructing human nature itself. So, like I said, I'm black-pilled. I think we're headed toward something very dangerous, something irrevocable, and something with a great degree of spiritual and eschatological significance.
So I think your vision of what a society based on natural law would look like and mine are very different. I think all that's really needed to return to a society that would very much be based on a natural law framework would be individual rights. So consistently respect the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution, give individuals the freedom to innovate to use technologies as they see fit or not, to have their own chosen ways of life. And some of them will choose to be more conservative or more cautious about technologies. Others will choose to embrace them. And we will see, of course, technologies have consequences. Some technologies will be adopted, others maybe not so much. But this has always been the way throughout history. And I don't see how that wouldn't be a natural law society. I think the issue is...
Well, I think this is a very impoverished idea of what the founders were getting at and of what, individual rights are about. I think this is what you're left with, basically. This sort of desiccated libertarianism is what you're you do me, you do you, and I'll do me, and we'll just not bother each other, is what you're left with when you lose that natural law framework, which we have.
And that telos.
What you seem to want is a society that has certain relational structures that follow certain templates. So you mentioned essentially a kind of cycle of life or stages through which a person progresses as they grow up and become parents and then mentor the next generation and pass on. And you seem to have a view of what the proper relationships are, say within a family or within a church community, etc. And again, a society...
I think getting married and having children and raising them is better than, joining a 6-person, polycule or something.
Yeah, and I would probably agree with you there with that comparison. However, again, a transhumanist society wouldn't end that at all and wouldn't necessarily result in those choices being suppressed in some way or not being predominant choices. And I think the fear that you seem to display is that if we allow alternative choices, then the kinds of choices that you think are better are going to fade away or are going to be competed away. I don't think so. So let's say there's full freedom for the transgender movement, hypothetically, whatever that would mean. I would say 95% of people are not going to choose to change their genders. Now, I don't think 5%.
Well, the number who have has increased drastically already through social contagion and has irrevocably harmed the bodies of many and many of these young people. So I think that's a point in my column, if anything.
There may be some social contagion, but I don't think it's going to reach 5%. Of the population.
I want to make sure we get to Neil
that's
as well.
Still thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Neil, you had a point you were saying. I want to make sure that you're heard out.
I didn't say anything.
I want to like clarify something, which is that with regard to how individual freedom would work in a natural law based society, is that choosing to restrict particular behaviors would be a prudential judgment of the political authority. I wouldn't be in favor of deploying state power to stamp out every behavior that is wrong or is contrary to natural law. I think there's a certain point where you're causing more harm than good. I think if you tried to ban masturbation and actually enforce that law, you would be forced to set up a totalitarian dictatorship, surveillance
dictatorship.
State. Yes, exactly. So these are all prudential judgments. My case for banning transgenderism across the board is less rooted in an objection to like the freedom of the individual to try to live as the opposite sex, and more rooted in a question of medical ethics. I think it's wrong for a doctor to harm their patient, and I think that when you do violence to someone's healthy body parts or healthy, hormone balances and bodily processes in accordance with some desire they articulate, that you've betrayed your Hippocratic oath, that you betrayed, or the Hippocratic oath's all like watered down and lame now, that you've betrayed medical ethics, that you've stepped outside of the purpose of medicine, which is restoring people to their proper human flourishing. It's more to me that the doctor shouldn't be allowed to do it.
Well, what if that doctor...
if I went to a doctor and said, cut off my legs, I don't think he should do that. Why should he do it if I indicate a different appendage?
Well, let's stick with the gender example, and then we'll go on to the cutting of legs example. So with the gender example, what if that doctor's medical procedure saves that person from the ill-advised decision to end their own life? And I think you and I would both disagree with the decision of a person with gender dysphoria to end their own life, but it does happen, unfortunately. And I think one of the justifications for these kinds of procedures is these people will then go on to live lives that they would consider fulfilling instead of ending their lives, which is bad by both of our frameworks. So there is that. Now, on the cutting off of legs, I don't support it, but there could be a future situation where people might choose to get prosthetics that are augmented, like make them run faster, etc. I would rather have that be done via exoskeletons that are applied in addition to one's biological limbs. So I personally would not be a proponent of electively removing an organ, a limb, any part of the body, but I would be a proponent, for instance, of strengthening that, making it more resilient, or using technology like some sort of removable prosthetic that could make one run faster. And in some cases, there might not be that much of a bright line. Let's say somebody was born with some sort of deformity in their leg, and that's still a leg, but if they could remove that and get a functional prosthetic that works like a more healthy person's leg, shouldn't they be allowed to do that?
That's something I believe I would support. Yeah, if there were no way of restoring the person's actual leg to a healthy state.
So I want to make sure we get back to the root here, because all of these different examples we're talking about, I think the root of this is that most modern people, they no longer feel bound by whether you could say like nature or the good or God. Like,
I do have to go here in just a couple minutes.
Okay, so. Sure, no problem. If they are bound by these things, then those frameworks, like the pagan and classical frameworks that recognize like general insights about telos, virtue, and flourishing, one could say, well, maybe those frameworks would work, and maybe they worked for the founding fathers, but they're not going to work for the masses. But maybe something that a lot of people already know. And again, Grayson, this is purely a utilitarian argument here for Christianity, purely utilitarian though, that since so many people already know what Christianity is, it's going to be easier to get them to follow that as opposed to go into more of these classical frameworks. And this is where I want to go to Neil. So Neil, like in this short amount of time that we have right now, what are your thoughts on the founding fathers and the way that they saw things? And is that in any way possible to bring towards the masses, or do the masses need what, let's say, some people, I know, Grayson, you don't think that, but some people, when they look at Christianity, would think of it as more of like a noble lie, like something to keep people, you know what I mean, right?
I mean, this is there's a quote from, I think it's from Jefferson actually, or no, it's from George Washington. It's from George Washington, where he's talking about like the importance of promoting religion in order to kind of maintain these.
I don't think they wanted an atheist.
Natural law principles that he saw the regime as being built upon, where he says that, you know, there may be some people in this society who are sort of naturally very virtuous and very like rational, free thinker types who can, you know, kind of reason their way to a virtuous life apart from religion. But he says that's always going to be a small minority. If we want to have a, virtuous republic, the way to maintain that virtue is through religion. John Adams.
But I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with Christianity either. I think that the founding fathers saw the greatest periods of society being in Greek democracy and Roman Republic, more leaning towards the Roman Republic side, where you have sort of like a public res publica, and the idea is that you have different schools of thought. Like, for example, like, I don't know if you guys know this, but heliocentrism was already proposed by Aristarchus and Archimedes long before the Enlightenment period. And you have different schools of thought. We had back in the pre-Socratic or even Hellenistic period, there was like technological advancements. There was different schools of thought. There was proto-science. Francis Bacon cites Aristotle's inductive reasoning for his scientific method. So I think they're looking back at that period of time and going, okay, they weren't being led by one particular dogma. You have different schools. You have the school of Parmenides, the school of Heraclitus, the school of Aristotle, the school of Plato, the school of the Eleatic school. And they sort of letting these ideas sort of kind of clash and simmer brings about the sort of society where people can think rationally. And I think that's what they were trying to bring back. I don't think I think they were looking at the Christian world of the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Spain, the Kingdom of England, and going, no, we're done with this.
Yeah. They were certainly like allergic to kind of religious justifications for absolute monarchy and to what they kind of saw as they were pretty anti-Catholic across the board. Very hesitant to embrace what they.
But even in terms
very,
of personal,
very allergic to like what they viewed as superstitions. Yeah, but I don't think it's quite as simple as that. It's simply a return to kind of pagan classical world. I think I agree with that. I think it's something that could have only happened in the Christian era. And there's Harry Jaffe is a great writer on this, where he talks about how in the ancient polis, the law was kind of handed down as divine, and it took Christianity to sever that link to where being a Marduk worshiper is to being a Babylonian is not the same thing as being a Christian is to being a Frenchman, right? Because the Holy Roman Empire people are Christians, and the Italians are Christians, and the English are Christians, and everything else. So you had to find a new basis for political authority and political legitimacy. The sort of ad hoc way to do that was to say, well, God chose this family to rule over you, which then works for a while, but becomes problematic when you have the Reformation and not everyone agrees on the church and all this stuff, and so you kind of have a re-establishment of political legitimacy on an idea of natural law that's believed to be confirmed by both reason and revelation, and that focuses on the on a fundamental human equality that's rooted in a shared human nature.
But which specific revelation, though? That's the thing that I have a problem with. I know you have to go soon, Grayson, but I keep running into this same question of revelation. Well,
for them, it's Christian revelation.
But does it specifically have to be that specific Christian revelation of Jesus Christ? Because this is what I don't understand. I keep hearing all these things about the founding fathers with all of these pagan traditions and the original song for what was that song, Neil? Do you remember, for Francis Scott Key?
The Anacreontic song.
Yeah, what was that? So that was like a Bacchic.
It was a song dedicated to Venus and Bacchus, and it was just.
And then it became
the same melody of the Star Spangled Banner that Francis Scott wrote over it and used that melody. Yeah.
So like when I hear these things, I still can't help but think that, yes, they had a telos and they had an understanding that there was something higher, but they did not attribute it to this particular thing that may have happened in the desert of ancient Israel, 2,000 something years ago.
Well, this is why I rely so much on Aristotle in my book, though, for my objections to transhumanism, because I specifically don't want to just say like, oh, God, God gave us a book that says not to do these things, so don't do these things. I want to make an argument that
sure.
That's what that's I believe all that, right? But I
that's the important.
I have my specific part, I have my specific Christian argument. That's one level. I have my sort of natural law argument, which is another level. And then below that, I have like my utilitarian argument, which is just that I think this is going to go really badly and is already going really badly.
No, I think
I got to go, guys. Gennady, it was a pleasure. If you want to just wrap up real quick.
Grayson,
it's been a pleasure talking to you. It really has.
It's been a great pleasure.
Likewise.
Please tell us where you can get your wonderful book, The Transhumanist Temptation.
Yes. I'll hold this up again.
It's, The Transhumanist.
It's available from Sophia Institute Press. That's sophiainstitute.com/transhuman. Always best to buy straight from the publisher. If you want to get it on Amazon, you can get it there as an ebook or an audiobook. I don't read the audiobook, so if you don't like my voice, that's good news for you. I hope you'll do that. And then you can follow me on X at Hemingway if you want, Hemingquay. My DMs are open.
Beautiful. The only last thing I would say before you press the button, Grayson, is that it was a great pleasure to have you on. I really appreciate you taking time talking to us about all this. The reason why I keep stressing on the Christian revelatory part is because I think this is what's going on in a lot of people's minds right now, where they are searching for what is going to be the answer to modernity, and they see a lot of these based Christian accounts right now on X, and I could see why they're gravitating towards that. I want to make sure that in all of this discussion, we keep our mind on the bigger picture here of making sure that whatever happens later on, it's not going to create this gatekeeping device that's going to set us back as well. So we're still going to be able to access that kind of telos that the people who would have been burning Giordano Bruno would not have been as much in favor of for humanity. That's the only thing I would say that I'm trying to prevent here while reaching out for knowledge. And with that, Gennady Stolyarov II, where could people find you?
Yes, so one could find me at the Transhumanist Party website, that's transhumanist-party.org, or on my online magazine, The Rational Argumentator, that's rationalargumentator.com. I also have a YouTube channel. It's G. Stolyarov II, so the first letter of my first name, my last name, followed by the second. I have an X account as well. It's also G. Stolyarov II, and then of course, the Transhumanist Party has an X account, Facebook group, Facebook page, Instagram account. So you can find us all over the internet. Blue Sky as well. The Transhumanist Party is on Blue Sky for the more left-leaning members of your audience. I think
what left-leaning members?
But it is, I think, important to note that we try to be a big tent organization. So within the Transhumanist Party, we have people spanning the entire conventional political spectrum and people with some unconventional views. So we have people ranging from socialists to anarcho-capitalists. We have some center-left, center-right members. We have members who are really apolitical or don't fit any of these conventional descriptions, because we are about articulating a vision that is very different from what tends to pass for political discourse these days. We are about a vision that can take humanity to the next era of our civilization and maybe transcend some of these age-old differences and debates. Though I do enjoy having debates, I think ultimately this is more about building a future where we can all coexist and achieve something better.
Beautiful. All right. And Neil, Gnostic Informant, you have the last word, and where can people find you and all that good stuff?
I just thought this was an awesome conversation. I'm listening to both make fairly good points. Grayson brought up some really good points too. You can find my channel at Gnostic Informant, youtube.com/Gnostic Informant.
Excellent. And you could find me on X at LeftPo. And guys, if you want to keep all of this going, make sure to smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, patreon.com/break the rules. I'm going to be having a lot of streams coming up soon with Jason Giorgiani, with Uber Boyo, with the All-Stars, as well as bringing in so many of the people from the mainstream, from all of these think tanks. The Christian dimensional merge is happening only on BTR. This is what we do best. So once again, patreon.com/break the rules, become a patron. And if you become a $20 patron, you are going to get the opportunity to be in studio in New York City during the live show. Or if you just become a $5 patron, that's great too, because you're going to have access to the live show as it's happening. You're going to see the sausage getting made before it goes out to the unwashed masses. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Have a great night. Bye-bye, everybody.